She had built an empire from nothing. She had weathered boardroom wars, hostile takeovers, and public scrutiny that would have broken most people twice her age. But standing in front of her bathroom mirror at 7 a.m. on the morning her ex-fiancé was marrying someone else, someone who was already carrying his child, Vivian Sterling discovered that none of it mattered. Not the wealth, not the penthouse, not the name that appeared on the covers of 3 different business magazines this year alone. She was about to walk into that wedding alone, and the thought of it made her feel like she was dissolving from the inside out. So she did something she would never have done under any other circumstances. She picked up the phone and called a stranger. If this story is already pulling you in, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The alarm went off at 6:45, same as always. Vivian silenced it before the second buzz, already awake. She'd been awake since 4, which was becoming a pattern she refused to acknowledge as a problem. Acknowledging it would mean admitting something was wrong, and nothing was wrong. She was fine. She had always been fine, and she intended to keep being fine for the foreseeable future. She lay in the dark for another 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling of her bedroom. 22-foot ceilings, custom plaster molding, a chandelier that cost more than most people's cars, and ran the day's schedule through her head the way she always did. 9 a.m. call with the Singapore team. Draft response to the Whitmore acquisition proposal. Lunch with her CFO, Marcus, who had been asking increasingly pointed questions about the Q3 projections and deserved an actual sit-down conversation rather than another round of voice memos. And then, at 3 o'clock, the wedding. She got out of bed. The apartment was quiet in a way that had stopped feeling peaceful somewhere around the 14-month mark of living alone. It was a different kind of quiet than the silence she'd grown up with, which had been the quiet of a small house where the heating system clicked and the neighbor's dog barked at the mail truck every Tuesday. This was the quiet of engineered insulation and triple-pane windows, and a building designed to keep the outside world exactly where it belonged, outside. Some mornings she loved it. Some mornings it felt like living inside a very expensive coffin. This morning it felt like the second thing. She made coffee. Not the elaborate ritual her kitchen was capable of, just the automatic drip machine that Marcus had given her as a joke 3 Christmases ago, and that she'd kept because it was the only gift anyone had ever given her that didn't feel like a transaction, and stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows while it brewed. The city spread out below her, just waking up. Yellow taxis and early joggers and the bodega on the corner that was already open, already lit, already full of people buying the first necessary things of the day. She watched a man in a delivery uniform pull up on a bicycle and prop it against a parking sign, and she thought about how he'd probably been awake since 5, and whether or not he had someone to come home to. She was not a person who thought about things like that, as a rule. The coffee maker beeped. She poured a cup, took it to her desk, and opened her laptop. The Singapore call went smoothly. The Whitmore response was more complicated than she'd hoped and took 90 minutes instead of 45. By the time she got off the phone with Marcus, who'd agreed to reschedule lunch to Thursday without asking why, because Marcus was the best CFO she'd ever had and understood that sometimes the why was not his business. It was 11:30, and she had 3.5 hours before she needed to leave for the church. She showered. She did her hair. She stood in her closet for longer than she cared to admit, looking at the dress she'd bought for this occasion, which was a deep burgundy that her stylist had assured her was both sophisticated and emotionally appropriate for attending your ex-fiancé's wedding, whatever that meant. She put the dress on. She looked at herself in the full-length mirror. She looked exactly the way she was supposed to look, polished, composed, untouchable, and she felt like a complete fraud. The thought that arrived next was the one she'd been successfully outrunning for 3 weeks. You don't have to go. But she did. Not because of Daniel, not really. She was mostly past Daniel, or at least she was 90% past Daniel, which was close enough that the remaining 10% didn't bear close examination. She had to go because not going would mean that everyone who'd spent the last 8 months speculating about her, pitying her, discussing her in conference rooms, and at dinner parties, and probably in the comment sections of her own press coverage, they would all be right. They would say she couldn't handle it, that she'd fallen apart, that Vivian Sterling, who had never visibly cracked under any pressure in her professional life, had finally found something she couldn't hold together. She was not going to give them that. But the thought of walking in alone was a problem she hadn't fully solved. Because alone meant visible. Alone meant subject to interpretation. Alone meant that every person in that church who knew their history would look at her and see exactly what she was trying so hard not to be. A woman who had given away the thing she loved most because she was convinced she wasn't enough to keep it. She sat down on the edge of her bed. Then she picked up her phone and called a number she'd been given by a colleague. A woman named Patricia, who had used the same service for a charity gala 2 years ago, and called it surprisingly competent. The agency was called Sterling Connections, which Vivian found either hilarious or ominous, depending on how much coffee she'd had. She'd looked it up at 2 in the morning 6 days ago, found their website professionally sparse, and their reviews uniformly discreet, and told herself she was just doing research. A woman answered on the second ring. Efficient, professional, not cold exactly, but focused in a way that suggested she dealt with unusual requests all the time and had stopped being surprised by them. "I need someone for this afternoon," Vivian said. "A social event. I need someone who can present as a—" She stopped, found the word she'd been avoiding. "A partner. A boyfriend. Someone I've been seeing for a few months. The story would be that we met through mutual friends. Nothing complicated. I just need someone who won't make it awkward." There was a pause that was not judgmental, just professional. "What time is the event?" 3 o'clock. Church ceremony, then a reception. I'd need him from about 2:30 until, I don't know, whenever it's reasonable to leave. "We can accommodate that. I have someone available whose profile I think fits well. Would you like a few details before I confirm?" "Yes." "His name is Ethan Carter, 32. He's done this kind of work before, mostly corporate events and formal occasions. He's described by clients as calm, adaptable, good in a room. Professionally educated. He has a son, if that matters to you for the context you're building." It didn't, but somehow the detail landed differently than the others. "A son." "That's fine," she said. "Yes, confirm it. I'll send his contact information. He'll reach out within the hour to arrange a meeting point." She hung up. Looked at herself in the mirror again. The burgundy dress. The perfect hair. The face she'd spent years learning to keep steady. "You're doing great," she said to her own reflection in a tone that conveyed the exact opposite. He texted at 12:45. "Hi. This is Ethan Carter. I was told you're in need of a +1 for a 3 o'clock event. If it works for you, I could meet somewhere nearby at 1:30 to go over the basics. Let me know what neighborhood works." It was a reasonable text, direct. No unnecessary warmth, no performative eagerness. She appreciated that. She sent him the address of the coffee shop 2 blocks from her building and told him she'd be the one in the burgundy dress. He was already there when she arrived. She spotted him immediately, which surprised her. She'd half expected someone who looked the part, who dressed up for the role in the way she imagined this kind of work required. Instead, he was wearing dark pants and a gray sweater that had been washed enough times to go slightly soft at the elbows. And he was sitting at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and no phone in his hands, just looking at the room with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was a person who was comfortable not filling every silence with something. He stood when he saw her, not in a practiced way, just a natural reflex, the kind of thing that happens when someone has been raised a certain way. "Vivian?" He said her name like a question, not an introduction. "Yes." She sat down across from him. "Thank you for being on time." "Of course." He settled back into his seat. "Coffee?" "I've had enough coffee to power a small city. I'm okay." The corner of his mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to it. "Fair enough." He folded his hands on the table. "So, do you want to just run through the basics, or do you need to know who I am first?" She studied him for a moment. He was reasonably good-looking in a way that read as lived in rather than constructed. A jaw that needed a shave, dark eyes that were assessing her the same way she was assessing him. No obvious anxiety about being looked at. Both, I suppose. "Okay, I'll go first." He said it easily. "I'm a single dad. My son's name is Noah. He's 7. He's currently at school making a papier-mâché solar system that he's been talking about for 2 weeks. I live in the Greenfield neighborhood, which you probably know as the part of the city where the coffee shops don't have marble counters. I do occasional work for the agency when the projects feel straightforward. I've done 4 or 5 events like this. Never a wedding." He paused. "Which means you might want to brief me a little more carefully than whoever did the last charity gala." She hadn't expected to find anything about this conversation funny. She found that slightly funny. Noted. She picked up the glass of water in front of her. My name is Vivian Sterling. I run Sterling Capital, which is an investment and development firm. I'm 30 years old. The wedding we're going to is for a man named Daniel Howell, who was my fiancé for 3 years and my partner for 9 before that. We ended things 8 months ago. The woman he's marrying is named Claire, and she's expecting their first child. She said it all in the same even tone she used in board meetings, the tone she'd perfected to the point where it almost felt like it belonged to her. I don't expect this to be easy. I'm not asking you to pretend it's easy. I just need someone who can be present, stand next to me, not disappear to the bar the second something gets uncomfortable. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I wasn't looking away from her, and he wasn't performing empathy. He was just listening in the specific way of someone who understood that sometimes the most useful thing you can do is not fill the space. How long were you together? He asked. Start to finish. 9 years. And you ended it. It wasn't a question, but there was something in the phrasing that made her look at him more carefully. Yes. Can I ask why? He said it without any edge. Not because I'm prying, just, if I'm standing next to you today, I'd rather understand what I'm actually helping you through. The surface version only goes so far. She looked at her water glass, looked back at him. She'd had this conversation exactly 3 times. Once with her doctor, once with her therapist, and once with Daniel. She'd never had it with a stranger. I can't have children, she said. I was diagnosed 18 months ago with premature ovarian failure. The odds of conception are effectively 0. And Daniel? She stopped. Not because the words were hard exactly. She'd said them enough times that they'd developed a kind of scar tissue. Daniel had always talked about wanting a family, a real family, he used to say, which I understood to mean something I couldn't give him anymore. So I ended it before he had to. Ethan was still looking at her, still not saying the things people usually said, the reflexive reassurances, the gentle protests that she couldn't have known what he would have wanted, the quiet implications that she'd acted rashly. He just let it sit there. That's a very lonely decision, he said finally. Yes, she said. It was. Another pause. Sure this time. All right, he said. Tell me how we met. They spent the next 40 minutes building the architecture of a relationship. It was stranger than she'd expected and also less strange than she'd feared. Ethan was good at this, not in a slick, practiced way, but in the way of someone who listened carefully and asked the right questions. He wanted to know the small things, where she liked to eat, what she did on weekends when work wasn't bleeding into them, whether she was the kind of person who talked through movies or watched them in silence. He noticed that she didn't gesture much when she was comfortable, but that her hands moved when something caught her off guard, and he filed it away without comment. She told him they'd met through a friend at a gallery opening, because that was the kind of story that didn't invite too many follow-up questions and suited both of their backgrounds plausibly. They'd been seeing each other for 4 months, long enough to be real, short enough that no one would be surprised they'd kept it quiet. His name would raise eyebrows at a Sterling Capital event, but at a wedding full of people who'd known Daniel and Vivian through their relationship, he would register primarily as her choice, someone she'd moved forward with, evidence that she was not, in fact, destroyed. You should know, she said, near the end of their coffee, that people are going to watch us. Some of them will be kind about it, some of them won't. That's fine. He didn't say it bravely. He said it the way someone says a fact. The mother of the groom, she added, is a woman who has never, in 11 years of knowing her, said anything to me that wasn't at least 40% condescending. She will find a way to make today worse. She is very talented at it. What's her name? Margaret. Margaret Howell. Good to know. She looked at him across the table, this stranger in his soft gray sweater, with his cup of black coffee and his 7-year-old son at school building a solar system. Why are you doing this? She asked, before she could think better of it. He considered the question honestly. I need the income. Noah's school had a fee increase in September that I didn't budget for. He said it without apology or self-pity, just as a fact among other facts. And he stopped for a moment. You looked like you were trying very hard not to ask for help. I find that relatable. She didn't have an answer for that, so she picked up her bag and said, We should go. The car's downstairs. He dropped 2 bills on the table for the coffee and followed her out. The car was a black town car, because Vivian didn't do ride shares to events that required a burgundy dress, and Marcus had learned years ago to simply keep a car on standby without being asked. The driver's name was Henry, and he'd worked for her for 4 years and had the quality of good service professionals everywhere, present but invisible, reliable as furniture. Ethan looked at the car without visibly reacting, which she appreciated. A lot of men reacted to the trappings of her life in one of 2 ways. Either intimidated, which manifested as a kind of stiff overperformance, or acquisitive, which manifested as a kind of lean-in she'd learned to recognize immediately. He did neither. He just got in and adjusted his seatbelt and looked out the window as Henry pulled into traffic. "Tell me about Noah," she said, after a silence that had been comfortable enough not to need filling. He looked at her. "Why?" "Because you mentioned him, and because I've been talking about myself for an hour, and because—" She stopped. "Because you're about to spend several hours doing something difficult for someone you just met, and it feels like I should know something real about you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's funny, like genuinely funny, not in the forced way kids get when they're performing for adults, but in the way that catches you off guard. Last week he told me that he thought clouds looked like thoughts that got too big to stay in anyone's head, and I didn't know what to do with that, so I just wrote it down." "You wrote it down?" "I keep a notebook for the things he says that I don't want to forget." She looked out the window. The city was doing the thing it did on bright October afternoons, turning golden and particular in a way that made everything look slightly more significant than it probably was. "How long have you been doing it alone?" 4 years. His mom left when he was 3. He said it without bitterness, but also without the carefully neutral performance of someone suppressing bitterness. It was more like someone who'd finished a long process of deciding how to feel about something and had arrived at a livable conclusion. She had her reasons. They were not good reasons, but they were hers, and she lives with them. Does Noah see her?" "Occasionally, when she's in the country." He shifted slightly. "She travels a lot. She built a different life. Noah's adjusted to what that means, I think. He's a pretty resilient kid." A pause. "Also, he has the full-time attention of someone who has read every single book on single parenting and still makes plenty of mistakes. So, the bar for resilience in our house is high." She laughed. It surprised her. Not a polished social laugh, but an actual, abrupt thing that came out before she could curate it. Ethan glanced at her. "Sorry," she said. "Don't apologize." He said it simply. "You should do that more often." She turned back to the window. Henry was turning onto Elm Street now, which meant they were 12 minutes out, which meant the part of the day she'd been dreading was almost here. She felt it in her chest. Not a panic exactly. More like the specific weight of something you've been carrying for a long time, getting heavier as you get closer to the thing you've been carrying it toward. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked. "I will be." She straightened slightly. "I'm always okay." He didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly, "It's all right if you're not, you know. That's not a flaw." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away from the window either, and somewhere in the city going gold around her, something in her chest shifted very slightly. Not enough to name, not enough to trust, but enough to notice. The church was a beautiful old building on the north end of the city, gray stone and tall windows, and the kind of architectural confidence that comes from being built in a century that had no doubts about permanence. The parking area was already full, guests in their best autumn dresses and suits moving toward the entrance in small clusters, speaking in the quiet, pleasantly performative tones of people dressed up for someone else's happiness. Henry stopped the car at the curb. Vivian didn't move for a moment. "For the record," Ethan said from beside her, "you look completely composed. No one looking at you would know you feel anything." "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation." He looked at her steadily. "I'm right here. We go in together, we find seats that give you some distance from the front, and if you need to step outside for any reason, you say your feet hurt. Works every time." She looked at him. "Your feet. Universal excuse beyond reproach. No one interrogates sore feet." She exhaled something that was almost a laugh. "Okay." She reached for the door handle. "Let's go." He stepped out first, not in an orchestrated way, just naturally, and held the door for her with the ease of someone who'd done it all his life. She took his arm without thinking about it, which told her something about how well the last 2 hours had gone. They walked into the church together. The thing about entering a room full of people who know your history is that you feel their awareness of you before you see it. It's a kind of atmospheric pressure change, a subtle shift in the social air that registers somewhere below conscious thought. Vivian felt it the moment they stepped through the arched double doors. Heads turned. Not everyone, not dramatically, but enough. The slow rotation of curiosity that moves through a crowd when something unexpected appears. She was unexpected. She'd been expected to be absent, she realized. The prevailing theory had apparently been that she wouldn't come, and her appearance was recalibrating calculations all over the room. She kept her chin level. She kept her hand on Ethan's arm. He walked beside her without stiffening, without scanning the room in the obvious way of someone trying to read the situation. He moved like someone who belonged where he was, which was, she thought, a remarkable skill that most people never developed. They found seats 6 rows from the back, on the bride's side, which she'd chosen deliberately, less loaded, less visible, less likely to intersect with the Howells' immediate circle. The pew was dark wood worn smooth, and the organ was playing something formal and gentle, and the flowers were white and abundant, and everything about the space was beautiful in the way that hurt. "You don't have to look at the flowers," Ethan said, low, beside her. She realized she'd been staring at them. "I picked those flowers," she said. "Well, not those exact ones, but that variety. Daniel and I had a whole conversation about calla lilies once. He didn't think they suited a wedding. I argued they were clean and elegant and didn't try to be more than they were." She stopped. "I guess someone changed his mind." Ethan said nothing, but his arm shifted slightly under her hand, just a small adjustment that somehow communicated that he'd heard her. The music shifted. The doors at the far end opened. She watched Daniel walk in. He looked the way he'd always looked, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of handsome that photographs well and ages gracefully. He was smiling, and the smile was real, and somewhere in the space between that smile and the 9 years she'd spent building a life with the man wearing it, Vivian found and lost and found herself again in the span of about 3 seconds. She felt Ethan's hand cover hers on the pew. Not dramatic, not staged, just there. She didn't look at him. She looked at the altar, at Daniel standing there waiting, at the room full of people who would watch a love story begin today and never know the one that had ended to make room for it. She breathed, slowly, evenly. The bride appeared at the end of the aisle. White dress, radiant smile, the particular glow that gets attributed to happiness and might just as easily be attributed to the good lighting and the knowledge that today, for once, every room arranges itself around you. The gown was different from the one Vivian had once, in a different life, allowed herself to imagine. Everything was different. She gripped the edge of the pew with her free hand, and Ethan's fingers moved slightly against hers, the smallest acknowledgement, the quietest possible form of "I'm still here," and she kept her face composed and her breathing steady and told herself the burning behind her eyes was just the church's air system, which was probably not calibrated correctly for October. The ceremony began. Margaret Howell found her during the cocktail hour. Vivian had been bracing for it, which meant she was as prepared as she was going to get, which meant she still felt her shoulders tighten when she heard the voice behind her. "Vivian, what a surprise." Margaret was 70, immaculately maintained, and had the particular social gift of making every compliment function as a weapon. She was wearing a cream blazer that probably cost as much as a semester of someone's college education, and she looked at Ethan with exactly the kind of calibrated curiosity that less practiced people would have mistaken for warmth. "Margaret," Vivian said, "it was a beautiful ceremony." "Thank you. We're so happy. The baby changes everything, of course. There's something so purposeful about knowing the family is growing." She let that land, moved her eyes to Ethan with the ease of a woman who had been deploying this particular social move for 50 years. "And who is this?" "Ethan Carter." He extended his hand before Vivian could speak, with exactly the right degree of confidence, not aggressive, not performative, just a man meeting someone for the first time. "Vivian's mentioned the Howell family. It's a pleasure." Margaret shook his hand, recalibrating. "Carter, are you in finance?" "Education." He said it evenly. "I've been working in the sector for about 8 years. Different world from Vivian's, but it keeps things interesting. How charming, Margaret said, in the specific tone that meant she found it not at all charming, but couldn't immediately identify the line of attack. She returned to Vivian. You should come say hello to Daniel. I'm sure he'd be glad you came. I will, Vivian said. Later, when things slow down. Margaret smiled the smile that had been making Vivian feel inadequate since she was 21 years old. Of course. Enjoy yourselves. She moved away. Vivian exhaled. Education, she said quietly to Ethan. Smart. Boring enough to end the conversation, specific enough to be credible. He plucked 2 glasses of sparkling water from a passing tray and handed one to her. How are you doing? Surviving. That counts. Does it? She meant it as a rhetorical question, but it didn't quite come out that way. He looked at her sideways. Yeah, he said. Today it counts for a lot. She didn't answer. She turned to look at the room. All these beautiful people celebrating something real and deserved. The arc of a love story she'd been adjacent to and then excised from. Daniel was across the room, laughing with someone from his firm, his hand resting lightly at the small of Claire's back. Claire was luminous in the specific way of pregnant women who are also happy, which is possibly the most particular and untouchable kind of radiance there is. Vivian looked away. I thought, she said carefully, that ending it was the generous thing to do, that it was the right thing, the thing a person who loved someone would do. And now? She was quiet for a moment. Now I'm standing in a room full of flowers I once said I liked, watching someone else live the life I cleared out of, and wondering if generous was just another word for afraid. Ethan didn't say she was wrong. He also didn't say she was right. He stood next to her and looked at the same room she was looking at, and said quietly, I think you can love someone and also be afraid. I don't think those are mutually exclusive. She looked at him. He was still looking at the room, profile in gray sweater and the particular steadiness of someone who'd had to be steady for a long time and had gotten good at it. What were you afraid of, she asked, when your wife left? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then, that I'd replicate it. That I'd somehow pass the pattern on to Noah. That loving someone that wrong for that long meant I had worse judgment than I thought, and that my worst judgment would be the thing Noah grew up watching. He paused. It took a while to figure out that the leaving was her failure, not mine, and then a little longer to figure out that even if I had failed, being wrong once doesn't mean you've lost the right to try again. Vivian said nothing. The orchestra had started in the ballroom, something slow and formal, and around them the cocktail crowd was beginning to drift toward the doors. We should go in, she said. Yeah, he said, we should. He offered his arm again. She took it again. They walked in. The toasts were what finally broke her open. Not dramatically. Nothing visible. She was Vivian Sterling, and she had learned 20 years ago how to cry without crying, which is to say, she had learned to hold everything so still inside her that nothing reached the surface. But the best man stood up and said something about Daniel finally becoming the father he'd always talked about wanting to be, and she felt it, a specific surgical pain. And she looked down at the tablecloth and breathed very carefully and told herself she was fine, fine, fine. Under the table, Ethan's hand found hers. It was such a simple thing, no drama to it, no announcement, just a hand, warm and present, slipping into hers and staying there. She felt his thumb move once across her knuckles, the barest acknowledgement, and she thought, this stranger has been kinder to me today than most people who call themselves my friends. She looked at him. I was watching the best man, his expression neutral and appropriate. But his hand stayed where it was. She turned back to the room. The speech continued. Daniel laughed at something, reached over, squeezed Claire's hand, and Claire leaned into him in that way people lean when they found the specific person they plan to be tired with at the end of their lives. Vivian's fingers tightened against Ethan's. He didn't pull away. When the speech ended and the room applauded, he leaned slightly toward her. You're okay, he said, low. Not a question. Not exactly reassurance either. More like a fact he was offering her in case she needed it. I know, she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands weren't. We can leave whenever you want. Not yet. Okay. They ate dinner. He let her talk about the most catastrophic business deal she'd ever made, and she told him about the Darrow acquisition of 2019. in more detail than she'd ever told anyone outside the boardroom, and he asked genuinely good questions that suggested he understood more about business structures than his worn sweater implied. She noted it, filed it away. The dancing started at 9. She watched from their table as Daniel led Claire onto the floor for their first dance. The song was something she didn't recognize, and she was glad for that. Glad it wasn't a song she knew, wasn't a song that had ever played in any room she'd shared with him. It was just a song. Theirs, not hers. Still, she watched and felt the particular solitude of watching other people inhabit a future that once had your name on it, and she was thinking about a lot of things at once. About her diagnosis, about the night she'd sat in the doctor's office and understood what the numbers meant, about the conversation with Daniel that had been so careful and so final and so full of the things neither of them could say out loud. "I think I need to go," she said. Ethan looked at her, not with relief, not with impatience, just with the calm, even attention he'd been giving her all day. "Yeah," he said, "let's go." They said their quiet goodbyes. She found Daniel briefly, a moment at the edge of the dance floor, 30 seconds of polite exchange, his new wife's hand on his arm, everyone being civilized and kind in the specifically exhausting way of people who are all aware of more than they're saying. She shook Claire's hand and meant the good wishes she gave, because she was not a person who wanted other people to be unhappy, even when their happiness was built partly on the vacancies she'd left behind. And then they were outside in the October night, the church spilling warm light behind them and the city spread ahead. And Vivian stood on the stone steps and breathed the cold air and let the tightness in her chest do what it needed to do. She didn't cry. Not exactly. Her eyes were wet and her jaw was working in the way jaws work when something is being held back, and she stood very still and let it move through her and recede. Ethan stood beside her. Just stood there. Didn't touch her, didn't speak. Let the night be what it was. After a minute, she said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You still look like you need a burger." She looked at him. "There's a diner," he said, 12 minutes from here. They make milkshakes that are aggressively not fancy. I used to take Noah there when he had bad weeks." She looked at him for another moment. At this stranger in his soft gray sweater, standing in the October cold outside a wedding she'd survived. "Okay," she said. "Yeah?" "Yeah." She pulled her wrap a little tighter. "Let's go." He hailed a cab, a regular cab, yellow, nothing arranged in advance. And they got in, and as the church disappeared behind them and the city opened up around them, Vivian Sterling felt something she hadn't felt in 8 months, maybe longer. Not happiness. Not yet. But something that might be its precursor. Something like the very first loosening of a knot that has been pulled tight for so long, you'd forgotten it was a knot at all. The city moved around them in the dark, bright and ordinary and indifferent, and for the first time in a very long time, she was glad she hadn't stayed home. The diner was called Polly's, and it had no business being as good as it was. It occupied the ground floor of a narrow building on Cartwright Street that looked like it had survived several decades of being exactly what it was without apologizing for any of it. The windows were fogged from the inside. The sign above the door had a letter P that flickered every few seconds in a way that suggested the bulb had been loose for years, and no one had gotten around to fixing it because no one felt it was ruining anything. There was a handwritten specials board visible through the glass, and a woman behind the counter who moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had been doing this exact job for a very long time and had eliminated every unnecessary motion. Vivian stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. "I haven't eaten at a place like this in," she tried to remember, "possibly years." "That's a problem," Ethan said, pulling the door open. The warmth hit her immediately, along with the smell of something frying in coffee that had been sitting on a burner long enough to get complicated. The booths were red vinyl, the tabletops were laminate, and someone had put a small plastic flower in a tiny vase at each table. Pink carnations, the fake kind, dusty at the tips. The whole room felt like a deliberate refusal to be anything other than what it was, and there was something almost defiant about it that Vivian found unexpectedly comforting. They took a booth in the back. The woman from behind the counter appeared with 2 laminated menus and a look that communicated she'd seen stranger pairs than them walk in and had long since stopped speculating. "Coffee?" she asked. "Please," Ethan said. Vivian looked at the menu. Everything on it was exactly what it promised to be. Burgers, fries, grilled cheese, pie by the slice, milkshakes in 6 flavors. No descriptions written in the language of ambition. No small plates. Just food. What's good? She asked Ethan. Everything. Get the cheeseburger and the chocolate shake. Don't overthink it. I don't overthink food. He looked at her in a specific way that suggested he didn't believe her. I don't, she said. You've been holding the menu with both hands for 90 seconds. She put the menu down. Cheeseburger and a chocolate shake. The woman came back with coffee, took their order without writing anything down, and disappeared. Vivian wrapped both hands around the mug and felt the heat move through her palms and thought that she could not remember the last time she'd sat in a booth in a diner at 9:30 at night, in a burgundy dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and felt, of all things, reasonably okay. Not good. She wasn't going to oversell it. But the specific acute pain of the ceremony had dulled to something more manageable, the way a very loud noise becomes ordinary if you stay in the room with it long enough. Tell me something, she said. Ethan looked up from his coffee. What kind of something? Something real, not about today. She turned the mug slightly on the table. Something about your actual life. He considered that for a moment, not in the way of someone deciding how much to reveal, but in the way of someone deciding where to start. Noah had a nightmare 2 weeks ago, he said finally. Woke up at 2 in the morning convinced there was something in the heating vent in his room. I spent 45 minutes with a flashlight explaining ductwork to a 7-year-old. Did it work? Sort of. He accepted that there was nothing in the vent, but then asked if something could be living inside the actual walls, and that opened up a whole separate conversation I was not prepared for at 2:15 a.m. He wrapped his hands around his own mug. We ended up watching a nature documentary about birds until he fell asleep. I watched the rest of it alone because I was weirdly invested in whether the Arctic tern made it to its destination. Did it? Yeah. A pause. Against significant odds. She looked at him. The diner hummed around them, someone at the counter laughing at something, the distant sizzle of the grill. You seem like you're good at it, she said. The dad part. Some days. He said it without false modesty and without pride, just with the honesty of someone taking an accurate inventory. Some days I'm completely lost and just trying to project enough confidence that he doesn't notice. He notices. He smiled slightly. He's a perceptive kid. Gets it from somewhere. I'm not sure where. From you, she said. Obviously. He looked at her, then looked back at his coffee. Maybe. The food arrived. The cheeseburger was enormous, and the milkshake came in a metal cup with a paper straw, and it was exactly what she hadn't known she needed. She ate without being careful about it, which was unusual. She was almost always careful about food in public, which was the kind of habit you developed when your face had appeared in enough magazine profiles that the idea of someone photographing you mid-bite felt like a genuine occupational hazard. Here, no one was paying attention to her. The woman behind the counter was filling a ketchup bottle. 2 men in work jackets were arguing about something at the counter with the comfortable intensity of an ongoing disagreement that had been running for years. A teenage girl was doing homework in a booth by the window with earbuds in, her fries going cold beside her open textbook. Vivian ate her burger and felt, incrementally, like a person again. He would have stayed, she said. Ethan looked up. She hadn't planned to say it. It came out at about the same pace as the thought formed, which was not her preferred mode of communication. Daniel, if I'd told him about the diagnosis instead of just ending it, he would have stayed. She set the burger down. I've known that for a while. He wasn't a person who gave up on people. That was one of the things I loved about him. She paused. Which means I ended it for my own reasons, not for his sake. I needed it to be for his sake, so I didn't have to examine my own reasons too carefully. Ethan was quiet. You don't have to say anything, she added. I wasn't going to. He took a fry. What were your reasons? She picked up her milkshake. Let the question sit. I was afraid he'd stay out of obligation, that he'd spend the next 20 years being decent to me and quietly grieving the family he didn't get, that I'd be able to see it on him, eventually, the specific look of someone who's made peace with a loss they didn't choose. She kept her eyes on the table. I couldn't watch that. I think I'd rather be alone than be someone's compromise. That makes sense, Ethan said. She looked at him. It does? Yeah. He met her eyes. It's not necessarily right, but it makes sense as something a person would feel. He paused. The part that doesn't make sense is doing it unilaterally, without asking him what he actually wanted. She held his gaze for a moment. No, she said finally, with the particular quietness of someone acknowledging a thing they've known for a while but haven't said out loud. That part doesn't make sense. He nodded once. Just once, like a period at the end of a sentence. They sat with that for a moment, which was the right thing to do with it. Not more, not a dissection, just acknowledgement. Then Ethan said, "The shake okay?" She looked down at the metal cup. "It's very good. Told you." "Don't make it a thing." "I'm absolutely making it a thing." She laughed again. The same abrupt, unguarded thing as in the car, the laugh that kept escaping before she could shape it into something more appropriate. He was watching her when it happened, and there was something in his expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not attraction, exactly. Or not only that. Something more like recognition, like someone identifying a sound they'd heard before in a different context. She straightened, picked up her burger again. "How long have you been doing this? The agency work?" "About 2 years. It started as a favor to someone. Then they asked if I'd be interested in occasional work. The events are usually corporate, charity auctions, work functions. This is the first time it's been something," he paused, "something with more at stake." "Is that why you asked about Daniel at the coffee shop?" "Yeah." He was straightforward about it. "I needed to understand the shape of it. You can't help someone navigate a room if you don't know what the room means." She looked at him. "You're better at this than I expected." "You expected bad?" "I expected adequate." She considered. "You were considerably better than adequate." Considerable praise from Vivian Sterling. He pressed a hand to his chest with a deadpan that was so dry she almost missed it. "I'll put it on the resume." She shook her head, finished the last of the milkshake. The diner was thinning out around them. The men at the counter had settled into a quieter conversation. The teenage girl had packed up her homework and left. And the space felt smaller and more specific, the kind of intimate that only happens in places that don't try to create it. When the check came, she reached for it automatically. Old habit. She paid for things the way she managed things, which was to say immediately and without discussion. "Let me get that," Ethan said. She looked at him. I know you can." He held her gaze. "Let me get it." There was something in the way he said it. Not territorial, not performing generosity for an audience. Just a person who wanted to do a small thing and was asking quietly for the space to do it. She took her hand off the check. "Okay." He put down the bills without making a production of it, and they pulled on their coats and went out into the October night, which had gotten colder while they were inside. The city was quieter now, the particular frequency of a weeknight past 10 o'clock, when the early evening energy has burned off and something slower takes its place. They stood on the sidewalk. A cab went by without stopping. "I'll call my car," she said. "I'll get the cab." He stepped to the curb and flagged one down with the ease of someone who did it regularly, which she found herself noting. He opened the door for her. "Thank you," she said. And then, before she could stop herself, "For today, all of it. Not just the cover story, the rest of it." He looked at her steadily. "You did most of the hard work yourself." "I know." She held his gaze. "But you made it easier than it should have been." He nodded. Not self-deprecatingly, not with performed humility. Just a clean, honest acknowledgement. "I hope the rest of it gets easier too," he said. "The after part. Whatever comes next." She got in the cab. The door closed. She watched him through the window as no, not Henry, a regular cab, she reminded herself, as the driver pulled away, and Ethan was standing on Cartwright Street in front of Polly's with its flickering P, getting smaller as the distance between them grew. She turned forward. The city moved around her. Something had shifted. She wasn't sure yet what to do with that. 3 days later, her phone rang at 10 in the morning. Unknown number, local area code. She almost didn't answer, because unknown numbers at 10 a.m. were almost universally either sales calls or minor crises she wasn't emotionally ready for. She answered. "It's Ethan." She sat up slightly from where she'd been leaning over her desk. "How did you get this number?" "You texted it to me the day of the wedding, in case you got separated in the crowd," you said. A brief pause. I thought about not calling. She waited. I was going to just leave it, the whole day, let it be what it was and move on. Another pause, shorter. But Noah's teacher asked him to write about someone he finds interesting, and he asked me if he could write about you. She blinked. He doesn't know me. I may have mentioned some things at dinner. I was asking about my day, and I told him a little about you, and he said, and I'm quoting directly, "She sounds like someone who's sad but pretending to be okay, like when you said the fish tank was fine, and then the fish died." Ethan let that sit for a second. I want you to know I addressed the fish tank comparison, and told him it wasn't appropriate to include in a school assignment. Vivian pressed her fingers to her mouth. Something in her chest was doing something complicated. He settled on writing about Neil Armstrong instead, Ethan continued. But he asked if you were real, and I said yes, and then he asked if you were okay, and I didn't know what to say. She stopped. He's 7. He's 7 and he's very perceptive about people's emotional states. I may have accidentally raised someone with a higher emotional IQ than me. She exhaled. Something almost like a laugh. Tell him I'm okay. Are you? She looked at her desk, at the documents open on her computer screen, at the view of the city through the window. 3 days since the wedding. She'd slept more than usual, which her body apparently needed. She'd had 2 long calls with her therapist, Dr. Renee Chu, who had listened to the whole day with the particular quality of attention that Vivian paid her specifically to provide, and who had at the end of the second call said something that was still moving around in her head. The fact that you went means you're ready to stop organizing your life around the wound. She wasn't sure that was completely true yet, but she was thinking about it. I think so, she said, more than I expected to be. Good. A beat. I wasn't going to call, he said again. But I'm glad I did. So am I, she said, and meant it in a way that surprised her slightly. They talked for 40 minutes, not about the wedding, not about the arrangement, not about any of the things that had organized the day they'd spent together. They talked about Noah's Neil Armstrong report, and about the education sector and about a nonprofit she'd been considering funding, and about the fact that Ethan had been trying to teach himself Portuguese for 6 months, and had reached the point of confidently ordering food, but not quite understanding the response. She told him about her first apartment, which had been a studio on the 4th floor of a building where the elevator was broken for 8 months straight. He told her about the year after his wife left, when he'd been so focused on making sure Noah didn't feel the absence that he'd completely forgotten to feel it himself, and had then had to catch up all at once somewhere around month 11, which he described as not my most functional period. What did you do? She asked. I ran, he said. A lot. Miles. I think I was trying to metabolize it physically because I didn't know how to process it any other way. A pause. It helped, mostly, though I did ruin 2 good pairs of shoes. And now? Now I run less. I've learned to stay in the room with the feeling instead of sprinting away from it. He said it simply, without therapeutic language. Mostly. Mostly, she repeated. I don't think anyone gets past mostly. His voice was thoughtful. The people who claim to be fully past things are either lying or not paying attention. She looked at the city. I think I've been lying, she said. Or not paying attention. I'm not sure which is worse. Neither is worse. You just have to pick a different approach. She was quiet for a moment. Then, would you want to get coffee? Not the agency thing. Just. She stopped. Started again. I'd like to keep talking, and this seems like a conversation that works better in person. There was a pause on his end that was not uncomfortable but was long enough to mean something. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. They met the following Saturday. The coffee shop they chose was the same one from the day of the wedding. She'd suggested it without thinking, and he'd agreed without commenting on the symmetry, which she appreciated. The marble counter he'd referenced, with the combination of amusement and distance that suggested he'd been in such places but didn't belong to them, caught the pale October light and turned it into something more deliberate than it probably was. She was there first. That was unusual. She was almost always late to things that didn't involve money, because her schedule had a way of compressing itself toward the things that had consequences. But she'd left the apartment 20 minutes early for reasons she wasn't fully examining. He arrived at exactly the agreed time, same worn sweater, different color, a dark navy this time, with a pull near the collar that he'd clearly noticed and had not yet done anything about. He had a small backpack over one shoulder, which meant he'd come from somewhere before this or was going somewhere after. He looked like what he was, a person in the middle of his Saturday, not a person who'd organized his whole day around the appointment. She found that she liked that, specifically. "You were early," he said, sitting down. "I'm always on time." "You were early," he said again, with the mild certainty of someone making an observation about weather. "Okay," she said. "I was early." He ordered his coffee. She already had hers. They sat in the specific comfort of people who have already had at least one difficult conversation and know the other person's capacity for honesty. "How was the week?" he asked. "Long. We're in the middle of acquiring a manufacturing company in the Pacific Northwest, and the due diligence is at the stage where everyone on both sides is exhausted and slightly irrational." She wrapped her hands around her cup. "I had to physically walk out of a conference call on Tuesday because the lead counsel on the other side was arguing a point so circuitously I couldn't maintain professional composure." "What happened?" "I walked back in 5 minutes later. He'd moved on. Crisis averted." "Classic move." He nodded approvingly. "What about your week?" "Noah lost his first tooth on Wednesday." He said it with the particular energy of a parent relaying important news. He'd been wiggling it for 3 weeks. I'd completely forgotten it was happening, and then I was making dinner and I heard this shriek from the bathroom and thought something had gone genuinely wrong, and I ran in and he was standing at the mirror holding a very small tooth and looking like he'd just made a major discovery. She smiled, not a social smile. "What did you do?" "Said all the right things. Took approximately 40 photos of him with the tooth for my own records. Then he asked me if the tooth fairy was real, and I had to make a rapid executive decision." "What did you say?" "I told him the tooth fairy was a concept that different families interpret differently, and that in our family, losing a tooth meant the person who raised you gave you $5 and a high five." He paused. He said that sounded like a ripoff compared to what his friend Marcus got. "What did Marcus get?" "Apparently the tooth fairy in Marcus's house leaves glitter." Ethan looked deeply tired. "Glitter. On everything. I told Noah our version did not include glitter, and he accepted this with more grace than I deserved." She was laughing again, that undone laugh, the one she couldn't organize before it escaped. Across from her he was watching it happen with the same quality of attention she'd noticed at the wedding, not cataloging it exactly. More like someone watching something they find quietly valuable without being possessive about it. "You should meet him," Ethan said. She stopped laughing, looked at him. "Noah." He said it carefully. Not casually, deliberately, which meant he'd thought about it before saying it. Not as anything formal. He's been asking about you since I mentioned the day, and he's not usually interested in people he hasn't met. He tends to be a little cautious with new people. She held his gaze. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" "Yeah? For him?" "No," Ethan said honestly. "I'm not completely sure about anything with him. I'm never completely sure. But I think it'd be okay." He paused. "He's just a kid who wants to know if the person his dad mentioned is as interesting as she sounded. No obligations attached." She looked at her coffee. At the table. Back at him. "Okay," she said. "Yes, I'd like that." He nodded. "Saturday breakfast. There's a place near our neighborhood that does really good pancakes. Noah calls them the ones with the edges, which means they're slightly crispy and he has strong opinions about pancake texture." "He sounds like someone I'd get along with." "Probably," Ethan said. "He has good instincts about people." She looked at him across the table. This man who had walked into her difficult day and not made it worse, which was possibly the lowest bar she'd ever set for another person, and also somehow the most meaningful thing anyone had done for her in a long time. She wanted to say something about that, but the words felt outsized for the moment, so she picked up her cup instead and said, "Tell me about the education company." He paused. A different kind of pause. Something shifting behind his eyes. "What do you know about it?" he asked. "Not much," she said. "You mentioned you'd been in the sector 8 years. I looked up—" She stopped. Admitted it. "I Googled you after the Wednesday call when I needed something to do that wasn't thinking about due diligence. Ethan Carter, education sector." She kept her voice level. "There's a Carter education group that's been in the news quite a bit this year. New funding round, expansion into 3 new markets. The founder is described as Deliberately low profile. Ethan was quiet for a moment. His hands were still on the table, loose. Not nervous. Something more like resigned. Not unhappily, just with the quality of someone who'd known a particular conversation would arrive eventually and had made peace with that. Yeah, he said. That's you. Yeah. She considered him, the navy sweater with the pulled collar, the backpack, the diner on Cartwright Street, and the $5 and a high five for a lost tooth. Why, she asked. Why the low profile? Why live like this if you don't have to? He looked at his coffee. Because I watched what money did to my marriage, he said, with the directness of someone who'd answered this question a lot in his own head. We had more than enough. And what it did was, it gave her permission to believe that the options were always open, that she never had to settle into the life she had because there was always something else available. Another city, another person, another version of herself. He paused. I'm not blaming money for her choices, but I watched what the kind of life it buys can do to people who aren't grounded by something else. And I decided I wanted Noah to be grounded, to know what things cost and what they're worth, and that those aren't the same number. She was looking at him carefully. And for you? Me? Is it just for him, or is it for you too? He was quiet for long enough that the question breathed. Then, I don't trust the version of myself that the other life was making. He said it quietly. I was getting good at the performance of it, the right rooms, the right restaurants, the right language, and I kept thinking, this isn't me. This is someone wearing me very convincingly. He looked up. I'd rather be the guy in the sweater who knows about good diners than the guy in the suit who's performing his own life. She held that thought, held it carefully, the way you hold something that has edges. I've been performing mine, she said slowly, for a long time. I know. It wasn't cruel, it was just honest. Is it that obvious? Not to people who aren't paying attention. He picked up his coffee. But you're very controlled in the way of someone who learned to be controlled. It's a survival skill. Those are visible if you know what you're looking for. What do you know about survival skills? A fair amount? He said it evenly. I told you. The year after she left was not my most functional period. She looked at him, thought about the miles he'd run, the shoes he'd ruined, the 2 a.m. bird documentary, the notebook where he wrote down the things Noah said so he wouldn't forget them. You put yourself back together, she said. More or less. Not perfectly. He met her eyes, but well enough to keep going. Outside, the October morning was doing its particular thing, bright and cool, the light coming in at an angle that made everything seem slightly more examined than usual. People moved past the window with their coffees and their dogs and their phone conversations, all the ordinary Saturday machinery of a city that did not know or care that two people were sitting at a marble counter having a conversation that was quietly changing the shape of something for both of them. I want to tell you something, Vivian said. Okay. The diagnosis. She looked at the counter, then back at him. I've told 3 people, my doctor, my therapist, Daniel. She paused. And you. He held her gaze. Why me? Because the day of the wedding you asked the right question and didn't flinch at the answer. She said it simply. And because I've been carrying it like a secret for 18 months, and I'm beginning to think that's part of what made it heavier than it needed to be. It probably is, he said. Everyone has opinions about it. When they find out what I should have done differently, what my options are, what the data says about... She stopped. I'm tired of it being a problem to solve. It doesn't have to be. People can't seem to help themselves. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I won't do that. If you're telling me because you wanted someone to hear it without that. She exhaled slowly. Yes, that's why. He nodded. Not with the kind of affected gravity that people brought to serious topics, not with false lightness either, just with the simple weight of someone who understood what they'd been given and intended to be careful with it. Okay, he said, just that. She felt something give in her chest. Not break, not crack, more like a door that has been held closed by pressure releasing slightly. Not all the way, but enough to let some air in. They stayed another 40 minutes. The coffee shop filled and then thinned again around them. At some point she mentioned a film she'd been meaning to see for 3 months and hadn't gotten to, and he said Noah had been asking about the same one, and they were talking about it in the way of people making a loose future plan before she'd fully registered that she was making one. When they left, they stood on the sidewalk in the bright October air, and the city moved around them with its ordinary Saturday indifference. "Saturday breakfast," she said. "The place with the edges. 10 o'clock. I'll text you the address." He looked at her for a moment. "You don't have to come if it feels like too much." "It doesn't." She picked up her bag. "It feels like the right amount." He looked at her in that way again. The not cataloging thing, the quiet noticing. "All right," he said. "See you Saturday?" She walked toward her car. He walked the other way. She didn't look back, but she was aware of the direction he was walking, in the way you're aware of warmth when you're standing near a source of it. Not something you look at directly, just something that registers. Saturday felt close. That was new. Saturday had not felt close to anything in a long time. She arrived at the restaurant at 10:05, which for her was effectively early. The place was called the Morning Table, and it occupied a corner spot in a neighborhood she didn't come to often. Not poor exactly, but lived in the way that suggested people here had been here for a while and planned to stay. The kind of block where the hardware store had been the hardware store for 40 years, and the woman behind the counter at the dry cleaner knew everyone's name. She spotted them through the window before she went in. Ethan at a table for three by the window, and beside him, a boy who was demonstrably not looking at the menu he was holding because he was too busy watching a pigeon on the sidewalk outside with the focused intensity of a naturalist. She pushed the door open. The boy looked up immediately. He had Ethan's eyes, the same dark, direct quality, the same lack of performance. And he was smaller than she'd imagined, and wearing a green jacket with a dinosaur patch on the sleeve, and he assessed her in the first 2 seconds with a thoroughness that was almost comical. "Hi," he said. "Hi," she said. "You must be Noah." "Yeah." He looked at her carefully. "You're Vivian." "I am." "Dad said you run a company." "I do." He considered this. "Does it have a good name?" She sat down across from them. "Sterling Capital." He appeared to think about whether this was a good name. "It's okay," he said finally, in the tone of someone offering measured professional feedback. "It sounds like something with money in it. That's generally the goal." He nodded once, as if this made sense. Then he turned back to the window. The pigeon had acquired a second pigeon and appeared to be in a territorial dispute over a piece of bagel, which Noah was monitoring with full attention. Ethan caught her eye across the table, and the expression on his face was the specific one of a parent who is both apologetic and privately delighted at their child's social manner. "He likes pigeons," Ethan said. "I can see that." "They're interesting," Noah said, not looking up from the window. "People think they're gross, but actually they have really good spatial memory. They can find their way back from places they've never been." "I didn't know that," Vivian said. "Most people don't." He glanced at her briefly. "You should." "I'll remember it." "Good." He returned to the window. The second pigeon had won the bagel dispute and was now departing with its prize. Noah appeared to find this an acceptable outcome. The waitress came. Noah ordered pancakes, the ones with the edges, he specified, with the confidence of a regular, and Vivian ordered the same, which prompted him to look at her with the first visible approval he'd demonstrated since she sat down. "Good choice," he said. "I take recommendations seriously," she told him. "Dad says that about you." She looked at Ethan. He had the look of someone who's been accurately quoted and is calmly accepting the consequences. "Does he?" she said. "He says you listened to him at the wedding even when it was hard," Noah said, with the simplicity of a person who has not yet learned to perform emotional intelligence, just to use it. He said that's unusual. She held Ethan's gaze for a moment. He was looking back at her steadily, without apology, without performance. "Your dad was helpful," she said to Noah. "At the wedding." "He's good at helping." Noah picked up his water glass. "He's the most useful person I know. I told him that on his birthday. He didn't know what to say." "What did he say?" "He said thank you, and then he made waffles for dinner, which is what he does when he doesn't know what to say." Noah put his water glass down. "He makes food. It's his thing." "I noticed," Vivian said. "He took me to a diner, the night of the wedding." Noah processed this. "Was it Polly's?" "It was." He gave a single satisfied nod. "We go there when Dad has a bad week. The milkshakes are the best part." "The chocolate," she agreed. "Strawberries better." he said, with absolute certainty. I'll try it next time. He looked at her again, that rapid, thorough assessment. Then something in his expression did something small and specific, the kind of minute shift that in a child means more than 20 words of adult conversation. Something that said, "Okay, I've decided something about you." He picked up his fork as the pancakes arrived. The edges were, she noted, indeed perfectly crispy. "You can sit here every Saturday if you want," Noah said, with the offhandedness of someone making an enormous offer. He was already cutting his pancakes. "We always come here." Ethan looked at the table, then at her. She looked at Noah, who was entirely focused on his pancakes now, having made his pronouncement and considered the matter settled. "I'd like that," she said. Noah nodded. "Good." The morning light came through the window and lay across the table, and the restaurant was warm, and outside on the sidewalk, the city was doing its ordinary Saturday things, and inside Vivian Sterling was sitting with a man in a navy sweater and a 7-year-old who gave restaurant recommendations with the authority of a food critic, eating pancakes with edges, and something in her chest was doing the slow, cautious, complicated work of beginning to open. She wasn't ready to name it yet, but she wasn't running from it either. The Saturday breakfasts became a fixture before anyone officially decided they would. There was no conversation about it, no moment where Vivian and Ethan looked at each other and said, "Let's make this a recurring thing." It just happened the way certain things happen when nobody resists them. The second Saturday arrived and Ethan texted the address of the morning table as if it had always been understood, and Vivian left her apartment at 9:45 without examining why she'd been ready since 9:15. Noah was already in his regular seat when she arrived, this time studying a library book about deep-sea creatures with the focused attention of someone doing research. He looked up, said, "The strawberry shake is really what you should get," and returned to his book. She ordered the strawberry shake. It was better than the chocolate. She didn't tell him that immediately. She waited until he'd finished explaining the bioluminescent properties of the anglerfish, and then said, casually, "You were right about the shake." He looked up. A single nod, entirely satisfied. "I know." Ethan, across the table, appeared to be controlling something in his expression. By the third Saturday, Noah had started saving her a seat, specifically the chair facing the window, which he determined was the best seat in the room based on pigeon visibility and light quality criteria, he explained with great seriousness. By the fourth, he'd started bringing things to show her. A drawing he'd made at school of what he imagined the bottom of the ocean looked like. A stick he'd found in the park that was, he said, definitely interesting. A paperback chapter book whose cover character he thought she resembled, which was a girl in a business suit riding a dragon. "I don't think I look like her," Vivian said, studying the cover. "The expression," Noah said firmly. "When you're thinking about something serious." She looked at Ethan. He looked at the ceiling. She kept the book. November arrived without much ceremony. Just the light changing, the temperature dropping, the city pulling its coat a little tighter and leaning into the darker half of the year. Vivian's schedule intensified in the way it always did in Q4. The acquisition closing, and a new fund launch running simultaneously, which meant she was averaging 12-hour days and eating most meals at her desk, and the Saturday mornings at the morning table became the single fixed point in a week that was otherwise entirely without stillness. She noticed that. Noticed how she protected the time in a way she didn't protect other appointments, didn't let meetings bleed into it, didn't check her phone at the table unless it was genuinely urgent. Marcus, who had worked for her long enough to notice behavioral changes without commenting on them directly, mentioned once that her Friday afternoons had gotten more efficient. "I'm motivated to finish by a certain time," she said. He asked no further questions, which was why he was still her CFO after 6 years. Outside of Saturdays, she and Ethan texted. Not constantly, not with the frequency of people whose attachment is new and anxious, but with the regularity of people who have found that the other person's thoughts are worth making space for. He sent her things Noah said, the notebook entries, the uncurated observations that landed with the force of something true. She sent him things she read that she thought he'd find interesting, or occasionally something absurd from whatever boardroom drama was currently unfolding, because he was a good audience for absurdity. One evening he called, and they talked for an hour and a half about nothing that could be recapped later as a conversation. The kind of talk that is mostly just two people being present in each other's company, the content less important than the frequency. She was sitting in her kitchen, not at her desk, which was where she usually took calls. And she was drinking tea. She didn't usually drink because she'd run out of coffee and found the box at the back of the cabinet. And the city was doing its November nighttime thing outside the window, and the hour and a half went without her noticing. When they hung up, she sat for a moment in the kitchen, in the quiet, and thought, I'm not pretending right now, which was a smaller thought than it sounds, except that for her, it wasn't small at all. The first time she met Noah outside of Saturday breakfast was on a Wednesday, and it happened by accident. She'd been walking back to her office after a meeting at a client's building on the west side, taking the route through Kelsey Park because the afternoon was cold enough to be invigorating without being punishing, and she needed 20 minutes of open air before she could face another conference room. The park in November had the stripped-down quality of a room after a party. The trees bare, the benches damp, the grass more brown than green, but still beautiful in the way of things that aren't trying to be. She heard Noah before she saw him. But if you fall in, you'd just have to swim. It's not that deep. It's deeper than you think. That was Ethan's voice, coming from the direction of the small duck pond near the east entrance. And it's November. The water is very cold. I wouldn't fall in on purpose. Nobody does. She came around a stand of bare-branched trees and found them at the edge of the pond. Noah, in his green jacket with the dinosaur patch, crouched down examining something at the water's edge, while Ethan stood slightly behind him with the specific posture of a parent maintaining appropriate readiness. Noah looked up and saw her first. His face did an immediate thing, a surprised brightness that he didn't try to contain. Vivian! He stood up so fast he nearly overbalanced. We're looking at a duck. She looked. There was indeed a duck, sitting on a partially submerged rock about 4 feet from the bank, apparently indifferent to human observation. Is it a good duck? She asked, coming to stand beside them. It's the same one that's always here, Noah said. He crouched back down, studying it. I think it's the one who doesn't leave for winter. Some of them go south, but this one stays. I call him Gerald. Gerald. She glanced at Ethan. I know nothing about whether his name is Gerald, Ethan said, but he's been here every time we've come, so the working hypothesis holds. Gerald has good instincts, she said, about staying where he is. Noah looked at her. Dad says that about you too. What specifically? That you're someone who decided where she wanted to be and built it. He delivered this with the comfortable directness of a child repeating something he's heard and found reasonable. That's why I think you're brave. The word landed somewhere unexpected. She looked at the duck, at Noah, crouched at the water's edge in his green jacket, at Ethan, who was watching her with an expression that was doing something complicated and quiet. I don't know if brave is right, she said carefully. Brave doesn't have to mean not scared, Noah said, with the authority of someone who has thought about this and reached a conclusion. It just means you did it anyway. She held it with both hands in the cold November air, beside the duck pond where Gerald sat on his rock in the gray afternoon, entirely self-possessed. Where did he get that? She asked Ethan. I'm honestly not sure, Ethan said. I find things in the notebook sometimes that I don't remember saying to him. She shook her head slowly. He's going to be formidable. He already is. It wasn't prideful, just accurate. They walked together for another 30 minutes, the three of them through the park's bare tree November landscape, Noah running slightly ahead and then doubling back, producing observations about things on the ground or in the trees, never quite leaving the radius of their company. Vivian and Ethan walked at the pace of people who aren't trying to get somewhere, which was a pace she hadn't walked at in a long time. The acquisition closed, she said at one point. I heard. Marcus sent me a press release. She looked at him. You know Marcus? He reached out after the wedding to thank me. Very formal note. He paused. He seems like a person who notices things. He's paid to notice things. I think he does it for free. Ethan glanced at her. How are you feeling about it? The acquisition. Relieved, tired. She tucked her hands in her coat pockets. It was the right deal, but the right deal is still exhausting. She paused. I keep thinking about what comes after, what I'm building toward. The company is in good shape, better than it's ever been, honestly. And I find myself sitting in my office sometimes after everyone's gone home, looking at the quarterly projections and thinking, and then what? Ethan was quiet for a moment. That's not a bad question. It's an uncomfortable one. Those tend to be the useful ones. She looked at him sideways. What are you building toward? He considered that. Noah had stopped ahead of them to examine something at the base of a tree. A pine cone, it appeared, which he was inspecting with the rigor of a field biologist. Noah's school has a program in the spring, a science fair. He wants to do something on animal navigation, how animals find their way without GPS. He's been talking about it since September. He paused. I want to be there, front row. Whatever the opposite of missing things is, that's what I'm building toward. She looked at him. Something in his face was just open when he talked about Noah. Not performed, not idealized, just genuinely present in a way that was rare enough to be noticeable. What about beyond that? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, a longer moment than usual, with that particular quality of attention that she'd come to recognize as him actually considering a thing rather than preparing an answer to it. I'm working on that, he said. It wasn't evasion. It was honesty about being in the middle of a process. She understood the distinction. Noah came back toward them holding the pine cone with both hands like it was a found artifact. This is a very good one, he announced. It's almost perfectly symmetrical. Excellent, Ethan said. Can I keep it? It's a pine cone. Can I keep it? Yes, Noah. You can keep the pine cone. Noah held it up and showed it to Vivian with the pride of a successful expedition. For the collection, he explained. What else is in the collection? She asked. Rocks, mostly. Some interesting sticks. A piece of sea glass that Dad's friend found at the beach. A button with a bird on it. He tucked the pine cone in his jacket pocket. I'm building a record. Of what? He thought about this. Of things that are worth remembering, he said finally. Then he ran ahead again toward the park exit because he had apparently exhausted the philosophical portion of the afternoon and it was time to move. She walked beside Ethan in the cold air and didn't say what she was thinking, and he didn't say what he was thinking, and somehow that was its own kind of conversation, the kind that doesn't need words because both people are already in the same sentence. December came with the particular violence of a city that goes from autumn to winter overnight. One day the park still had leaves on the ground. The next there was frost on the benches, and the wind had a blade in it that hadn't been there the day before. The Christmas decorations went up on the commercial streets, which in Vivian's neighborhood meant a tasteful kind of festivity, white lights, no plastic Santas. And in Noah's neighborhood meant more varied and therefore more interesting expressions of seasonal enthusiasm, including one house on their block that had, he reported to her gravely one Saturday, a full-size inflatable penguin in a scarf, which Dad says is technically not a Christmas animal, but I think is acceptable. I side with the penguin, Vivian said. I knew you would, Noah said. Her phone calls with Dr. Renee Chu were changing in tone. In the early months after the diagnosis, the sessions had been organized around processing, the grief of it, the specific loss of a future she'd imagined, the way it had reorganized her sense of herself and her relationship. They'd done that work carefully, and it had been real work, the kind that required going into the parts of yourself that you've been bypassing and staying in the room with them. Now the sessions were more about the going forward shape of things. Tell me about Ethan, Dr. Chu said in early December. I've told you about Ethan. Tell me more. Vivian looked at the window of Dr. Chu's office, which overlooked a small courtyard that currently had a naked tree in it and a single pigeon, she thought of Noah, sitting on the fence. He's honest in a way that I find easier than I expected, she said. Most people's honesty is selective, strategic. They're honest about the things that make them look good or interestingly flawed. He's honest about things that don't serve him, things he got wrong, things he's still figuring out. How does that affect you? She thought about it. It makes me less careful, she said, which is unusual. I'm almost always careful. Careful how? What I let people see, what I give away. I've been managing the version of myself that other people interact with for so long that I sometimes forget it's a version. She paused. He doesn't seem interested in the managed version, and I haven't found myself reaching for it around him. What about Noah? The question landed somewhere warm. He's 7, and he told me I was brave, in the same tone he uses to report facts about bioluminescence. She paused. I cried in my car afterward, which I didn't expect. Why do you think you cried? She was quiet for a moment. Because the last time anyone told me I was brave, it was in the context of the diagnosis. Someone saying I was brave to handle it so well. And that's a kind of bravery I'd rather not have needed. She turned from the window. Noah said it about something else, about having built something, about still being here and building more. She paused. It felt different. It felt like it was about a version of me I might actually want to be. Dr. Chu was quiet in the way of someone giving something space to breathe. Are you afraid? She asked. Of what? Of what this is becoming. Vivian looked at the single pigeon on the fence. It cleaned its feathers methodically, entirely at ease in the cold, going about its business with the complete indifference of something that has found its own stability. Yes, she said. But I'm not running. That's different from before. I know. Sam. The thing that broke open the careful equilibrium they'd been maintaining happened on a Thursday evening in the second week of December, and it began with a phone call that Vivian didn't expect. She'd been in back-to-back meetings since 8 in the morning and had just returned to her office at 6:30 with a glass of water and the specific exhaustion of someone who has been performing competence for 10 hours straight. She was standing at the window with her coat still on, letting the silence of the empty floor settle around her, when her phone buzzed. The name on the screen was one she hadn't expected. Daniel Howell. She looked at it for 3 full rings. Then she answered. Daniel. Vivian. His voice was the same as it had always been. Careful, modulated, a lawyer's voice, trained to sound reasonable under all conditions. I hope this isn't a bad time. It's fine. She sat down at her desk. What's going on? A pause. I saw you at the wedding. He said it carefully. I've been meaning to reach out since then, but it kept not feeling like the right time. And now it does? Claire and I are expecting, he said. We announced publicly today. I wanted you to hear it from me first, but the timing was, the announcement went up this afternoon and I realized I should have called earlier. She let that land. Felt the weight of it, which was real but not crushing, which itself told her something. I know, she said. I was at the wedding, Daniel. It was clear then. Another pause. I know, I didn't want you to see the news cycle version of it without having spoken. I appreciate that. Silence. The kind that exists between people who shared a long history and are now living in its aftermath. The man you brought, Daniel said. To the wedding. Ethan. He seemed good. For you. He said it with the specific care of someone choosing words that are true but also kind, which was the version of Daniel she had loved most. I could tell. I know what you look like when someone makes you feel seen. She was quiet. I wanted to say that, he said, and that I don't have any unfinished business. I wanted to make sure you knew that. I'm exactly where I should be, and I hope you are too. I'm getting there, she said. Good. And then, more quietly, I'm sorry, Vivian, for the ways I let you carry things alone. I didn't know at the time about the diagnosis, about what you were going through. And by the time I understood more, you'd already made the decision. She breathed. You would have stayed, she said. Of course I would have stayed. I know. She looked at the city through the window. I think I knew. I think I left because I was afraid of being your sacrifice. You're settled for. And that was mine to work out, not yours. You didn't do anything wrong. Another silence, but different from the first. Cleaner. I think we were both doing our best, Daniel said. Yeah, she exhaled. I think so. They spoke for another 10 minutes. Easy, final things. How the firm was doing, a mutual friend's new baby, the kind of conversation that puts furniture back in order. And then they said goodbye in the way of people who are no longer in pain about each other. And she set the phone on the desk and sat in the quiet of her empty office for a long time. She felt, not nothing, something. But it was more like the feeling of setting something down that you've been carrying for so long you forgot it was in your hands. Not relief exactly. Completion. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. He answered on the 3rd ring, slightly out of breath. Hey, 1 second. The sound of background noise, something crashing, Noah's voice saying I didn't mean to. Noah, it's fine, buddy, it's fine, please don't. Yes, I'll get a paper towel. Then back to her, calmer. Sorry, we had a paint incident. Paint. He's doing a project for school. There was a misunderstanding about what controlled workspace means. He paused. What's up? You okay? Daniel called, she said. A beat. Yeah? He wanted to congratulate himself on the baby announcement, thoughtfully. She paused. And to tell me I seemed good at the wedding, with you. Ethan was quiet for a moment. She could hear Noah in the background explaining the paint incident in detail, which appeared to involve a paper towel roll used as a lever. Are you okay? Ethan asked. I am, she said. That's actually the thing I wanted to tell you. She paused. I'm okay. I think I actually am. I believe you, he said. He said I looked like someone who was seen. She paused. He said he could tell. A longer silence this time. Vivian, he started. Don't say something careful, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not sure I'm good at not saying careful things. Try. He exhaled slowly. I think about you, he said. More than I planned to. He said it plainly, without flourish. Since the diner. Since before that, honestly. The coffee shop, when you admitted you were early. She could hear him smiling slightly, even at a distance. I don't know what that is yet, but it's there. She held the phone. Outside her window, the city was full of December dark and lights, the whole bright, cold, beautiful system of it running without her input. I think about you too, she said. Noah's voice in the background went up in volume, something about blue paint and the carpet. Ethan said something to him, covering the phone for a moment, and she could hear the muffled negotiation of a parent dealing with a child-related crisis and carrying on an important conversation simultaneously, which somehow made her feel warmer toward him than any composed and scheduled moment could have. I have to. The carpet situation requires me, he said, coming back. Go fix the carpet. I'll call you later. Okay, Vivian. Yeah? Don't think about it too hard tonight, he said. Just let it be what it is. She looked at the city. Okay, she said. She sat at her desk for a while after hanging up, not working, not thinking too hard, just sitting with the fact of where she was. In her office, in the dark and lit city, 30 years old, her heart not broken, not rebuilt into something new and perfect, just working again. Functioning in the direction of something. The acquisition was closed. The fund launch was on schedule. Dr. Chu's voice was in her head saying, that's different from before. Daniel's voice was saying, you looked seen. And somewhere in a house in Greenfield, a man was dealing with blue paint on a carpet, and a 7-year-old was explaining why the paper towel roll had been misused, and somehow all of it was connected to her in a way that felt, for the first time in a long time, like something she didn't want to walk away from. The following Saturday it snowed for the first time, just lightly, the kind of snow that doesn't stick but makes the air feel new. Noah stood outside the morning table for 5 full minutes before anyone could get him inside, face turned up, watching the flakes with the expression of someone receiving confirmation of a long-held theory. Every snowflake is actually different, he informed Vivian when they finally got him to a booth. Like, genuinely different, not just kind of. I've heard that, she said. Most people think it's just a thing people say. He regarded her. But it's science. I believe you. Good. He opened his menu, satisfied. Ethan sat across from her, stirring his coffee, watching the snow through the window. He looked at her once, briefly, and she looked back. And neither of them said anything that needed to be said out loud because some things work better as a look. A quiet agreement. An acknowledgement of the private thing that had shifted between them. The pancakes arrived. The edges were perfect. Noah distributed maple syrup with the precision of someone following a system. Outside, the snow kept falling in its uncertain way, not committing, but here. Vivian cut into her pancakes and felt, this was the exact and only word for it, at home. Not in the way she'd ever felt at home before, which had always been a solo construction, a thing she'd built and maintained herself. This was different. It was something built around people rather than by her for herself. Imperfect people, with paint on the carpet and worries about cost and 7-year-olds with notebooks full of pine cone documentation and the kind of honesty that was inconvenient and necessary. She didn't name what it was. She was better than she'd been about letting things be what they were without rushing to define them. But she felt it. Warm and specific and growing. The snow fell. Noah ate his pancakes. Ethan's hand rested on the table between them, not reaching for hers but close enough that the distance was deliberate, the proximity its own kind of statement. She put her hand next to his, just next to it, their fingers barely touching, the lightest point of contact, the kind of thing that could be accidental. It wasn't accidental. He turned his hand slightly. Their fingers intertwined for a moment. No announcement, no punctuation, just a small warm fact in the cold December morning. Noah looked up from his pancakes and looked at their hands and looked at his father, and then at Vivian, and whatever he concluded, he appeared to find it acceptable, because he returned to his breakfast with the composure of someone who has noted a development and filed it under expected outcomes. "There's a movie at the Park Theater next weekend," he said, around a bite of pancake. "It's about space. Dad said maybe." "Maybe what?" Ethan said. "Maybe we could all go." He did not look up from his plate. He said it with studied casualness. "All three." Vivian looked at Ethan. He looked back at her. "Maybe," he said. Noah nodded once. "Okay." He reached for more syrup. "That means yes." Outside, the snow came down soft and unremarkable, as if it had always been doing this, as if the world had always been this particular temperature and this particular color. And inside the booth, Vivian was still herself, controlled and private and occasionally still afraid. But she was also, undeniably, somewhere she had not been before. And she was not running. The space movie was about a woman who got stranded on a research station orbiting Jupiter and had to figure out how to get home using only what she had on the ship. Noah sat between them in the Park Theater, a small outdoor cinema that had been enclosed for winter with a heated, transparent canopy which Noah had described as basically a snow globe but for movies. And he watched the whole thing in near total silence, which Ethan told her afterward was the highest possible indicator of genuine engagement. When the woman on screen finally made it back to Earth, Noah let out a breath that had apparently been held for some time, and then turned to Vivian and said, "She never stopped trying, even when the math wasn't working." "No," Vivian said, "she didn't." "That's the important part," he said, with the gravity of someone drawing a conclusion that applies beyond the film. Then he asked if they could get hot chocolate, and the philosophical moment concluded. They walked to a cart near the park's east gate, the three of them, and Noah held his cup with both hands, and told them at length about what he would do if he were stranded in space, which involved a detailed plan about rationing, and also, at one point, talking to the ship's computer as if it were a person to keep his morale up. Ethan listened with genuine attention, occasionally asking questions. Vivian watched them. This specific rhythm between father and son, the way Ethan never talked down to him, never performed patience, just actually listened, and felt the warmth of it in a way that was becoming harder to keep at a comfortable distance. She wasn't trying very hard to keep it at a distance anymore. That was new. The three of them walked back through the park in the December cold, Noah in the middle, and at some point he reached up and took both their hands without prelude, the way children do when they decide something. Not asking, just doing. The confidence of someone who has assessed the situation and found it acceptable. Vivian felt the small grip of his hand in hers and didn't say anything, and Ethan didn't say anything, and Noah swung their arms slightly in the contented way of a person for whom the world has arranged itself correctly. Later, after they dropped Noah at a school friend's birthday party, he went in holding his gift bag with one hand and waving back at them with the other without turning around, which was, Ethan said, his version of a graceful exit. They walked back to the car slowly. "He did that on purpose," Vivian said. "The hands thing." "Of course he did." Ethan didn't sound surprised. "He's been waiting to do that since the first Saturday at the morning table." She looked at him. "He told you that?" "Not in those words. He told me you were probably someone who needed to be included, which, for a 7-year-old, is a fairly precise social diagnosis." She looked forward. The park was bare and gray and beautiful in its winter state, and the city hummed at the edges. "He's not wrong," she said. "No," Ethan said. "He usually isn't." She glanced at him sideways. He was looking ahead, hands in his coat pockets, the particular unhurried quality of someone who had been running at full speed for years and had recently remembered that walking was an option. She thought about what it had taken to produce that quality in him. The year of running literal miles, the conscious decision to strip away the performance of wealth, the daily practice of choosing the simple thing over the impressive one. She thought about how easy it would be to underestimate him, and how quickly that mistake would reveal itself. I want to ask you something, she said. He looked at her. Okay. When we first met at the coffee shop, you said you needed the income for Noah's school fees. She paused. And then I found out about Carter Education Group. She kept her voice level. Those two things don't fit together. You could fund the school fees 100 times over without noticing. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I could. So why the agency work? He walked another few steps before answering. I started doing it before the company reached the scale it's at now. It was genuine then. We were lean. I was bootstrapping. The agency income helped cover gaps. He paused. And then the company grew and I kept doing it, and I had to be honest with myself about why. And? Because it kept me in contact with the version of myself that helps because it's useful, not because it's strategic. He said it with the candor of someone who has done the internal work of an honest answer. Everything at Carter Education moves fast. Decisions with 7-figure consequences. Investors who want returns. Expansion timelines. It's easy to become the person the company needs instead of the person you actually are. He looked at her. The agency work is 3 hours in a room with someone who needs a specific kind of help. No leverage. No ROI. Just being useful. She absorbed that. And then you got me. And then I got you. A pause that carried something in it. Which was not what I expected. She looked at the path ahead of them. What did you expect? I expected someone managing a difficult afternoon. I expected to be a useful prop for a few hours. He paused. I didn't expect someone who was genuinely trying to understand herself in the middle of one of the hardest days she'd had in a year, and doing it with more honesty than most people manage in comfortable circumstances. She turned that over. I wasn't that honest. You were more honest than you think. He glanced at her. You told me about the diagnosis in the first 20 minutes of knowing me. I don't know why I did that. I do, he said. Because you were exhausted from carrying it as a secret, and I asked the right question, and you made a split-second decision that the weight wasn't worth the protection. He paused. That's not weakness. That's a very healthy instinct. She was quiet for a moment. Dr. Chu says the same thing. Dr. Chu sounds like someone worth listening to. She charges appropriately for the insight. The corner of his mouth lifted. They'd reached the park exit, the street ahead busy with mid-Saturday traffic, the city asserting itself after the relative quiet of the trees. He held the gate. She walked through it, and he fell back into step beside her, and they stood on the sidewalk waiting for the light, shoulder to shoulder, and she became aware that somewhere in the last 20 minutes the conversation had shifted from questions into something that was no longer asking anything, just stating things that were true, clearly, in daylight, without the cover of particular circumstances. What happens if this gets complicated? She said. He looked at her with the steadiness she'd come to think of as specifically his. It's already complicated. More complicated. I don't know, he said, but I'd rather be in complicated with you than in simple with the alternative. He paused. Is the alternative something you're actually considering, or is this the controlled version of you looking for a reason to manage the distance? She stared at him. You do that, he said. Not unkindly. When something gets close enough to matter, you start assessing its structural weaknesses. I've watched you do it with me twice in this conversation. She opened her mouth, closed it. The light changed. They crossed. You're not wrong, she said on the other side. I know. That's annoying. Probably. He glanced at her. I've been doing the same thing for the record. It's not just you. What are you assessing? Whether I'm ready, he said, to let someone into the part of our life that's... He paused, choosing carefully. The Noah part. The actual daily architecture of it. It's not something I can undo if it goes wrong. She looked at him. I understand that. I know you do. He stopped walking for a moment. They were on a quieter side street now, a half block from where his car was parked. I think I'm ready, he said. I've been trying to be sure, and I've realized that being sure isn't the same thing as being ready. Readiness is more like deciding that the person is worth the risk. She held his gaze. The December air was cold and still. Is that what you're deciding? She asked. Already decided, he said. I'm just telling you. She didn't have an answer that was proportionate, so she didn't try to find one. She looked at him in the winter light, This man who wore soft sweaters and kept notebooks and made food when he didn't know what to say, and had raised a son who understood bravery better than most adults. And she felt something that was not the complicated, negotiated feeling of people who are proceeding carefully toward each other. It was simpler than that. Warmer. More like arrival than approach. She stepped forward and kissed him, just like that. No preamble, no negotiation, no managed version of herself deciding whether it was appropriate. Just her hands on the front of his coat, and his hands coming up to hold her arms and the cold air around them. And it was not elegant or cinematic because she'd started slightly too quickly, and their noses bumped for a half second before they adjusted. And he made a sound that was almost a laugh, and she did too. And then they weren't laughing, and it was real and warm, and the city went on around them with complete indifference, which was exactly right. When they pulled back, he looked at her. Her coat lapel was slightly crooked from his hands. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. He fixed her collar without comment. She straightened his, which didn't need straightening but gave her something to do with her hands. "Noah's going to be unbearable about this," he said. "He's going to say he knew. He absolutely knew." He looked at her. "He told me in October that you had nice eyes, but that you looked like you'd forgotten to rest them." She laughed. The unguarded one. "That child. I know." But he was smiling in the specific way of someone who would not change a single thing about the child in question. They walked to the car. He drove her home. She sat in the passenger seat and they talked about nothing in particular. The space movie, Noah's ongoing pigeon research, a news story about a tech company doing something inadvisable, and the nothing in particular had the quality of something that belonged to them, a private frequency that had been developing since October and was now simply how they were with each other. When he pulled up outside her building, she sat for a moment before getting out. "Saturday breakfast," she said, obviously. "Tell Noah I've been doing more research on animal navigation, for when he needs a collaborator on the science fair project." Ethan looked at her. Something moved in his face that was private and significant. He's going to... He stopped. "He's going to love that." "I know," she said, and got out. January arrived, and with it the particular clarity that comes after the holiday season dissolves. The decorations come down. The city reasserts its ordinary geometry, and whatever you've been building during the covered festive months becomes visible in the plain winter light. What Vivian had been building was visible in the plain winter light, and it was this, a life that had more than one room in it. She was still herself. The company was still consuming and demanding. Marcus still had pointed questions about projections. She still took calls at 6 a.m. from the Singapore team and ate lunch at her desk more often than not and organized her days around the priority structure she'd been maintaining since her 20s. None of that had changed. But there was now a Saturday that she protected without apology. There were evenings when Ethan came to her apartment and they cooked something, badly, usually, because neither of them was a confident cook, and their culinary attempts had a comedy of errors quality that she found she didn't mind, which itself was notable, and talked for hours about the things people talk about when they've stopped trying to present themselves and started just being present. There were Sunday afternoons when she went to Noah's house in Greenfield and sat at the kitchen table while Noah showed her the latest developments in the collection. A new piece of sea glass, a moth wing found intact on the windowsill, a small plastic astronaut that had come out of a cereal box and been promoted to significant object status by unanimous household decision. She and Noah had developed their own specific rapport, which did not resemble her rapport with anyone else she knew. It was built on the exchange of information. She told him things about business that she simplified but didn't dumb down, because he had no patience for condescension and the instinct to detect it, and he told her things about the animal kingdom and the physical properties of interesting rocks and the social dynamics of second grade, which was apparently more complex than most people appreciated. They had ongoing debates about whether clouds or the ocean was more scientifically interesting. He maintained ocean, she argued clouds, and neither of them was willing to concede, and neither of them wanted to end the argument because it was a good one. "You're different when you're with him," Ethan said one evening, when Noah had gone to bed, and they were sitting on his couch with the low-volume television neither of them was watching. "Different how?" "Less contained." He considered the word. "You relax in a way that takes longer to happen with adults. He gets it out of you faster." "He doesn't give me the option of being controlled," she said. He just asks what he wants to know and says what he thinks. There's no social negotiation. It's efficient. You like efficiency. I like honesty. She looked at him. He's the most honest person I know. In a way that doesn't feel like a judgment. Most adult honesty comes with agenda attached. Including mine? Yours is mostly clean, she said, with occasional strategic deployment. He looked at her. Give me an example. You told me you'd already decided you were ready before you told me you'd decided. That was a presentation choice. I wanted to give you the conclusion before the reasoning. You process conclusions better when they arrive first. See, she said, strategic or considerate. Fine, both. He smiled. She did too, the small private version that had become his specifically, not the boardroom smile or the social event smile, but the one she hadn't had occasion to use much before him and now used without planning. The television was showing something about nature, a bird doing an elaborate dance to attract a mate. Noah would have had opinions. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, Ethan said. She looked at him. His tone had shifted slightly, not to something heavy, but to something with more weight in it than the ordinary evening conversation. Carter Education is doing a regional summit in the spring, he said. It's the first time we're doing it publicly, fully under the company name, full press coverage, which means I'll be visible in the way I haven't been. He paused. It'll change things. The way people perceive me. The low-profile thing won't be entirely sustainable anymore. How do you feel about that? Mixed. He said it directly. The company's at the stage where the visibility serves the mission. We can reach more schools, more partnerships, more funding sources, if people know who we are. He paused. But I valued the private way of living, the space where I'm just Noah's dad and the guy in the sweater. You'll still be those things, she said. Yeah, he looked at her. But I wanted you to know that the public version of me is coming, and it's not who I am at the morning table, but it is me, genuinely. I don't want you to feel like you got one version and then got surprised by another. She held that. I looked you up, she reminded him. Back in October, I knew what you'd built. I know. But knowing and encountering are different things. She thought about what that meant. The summits, the press, the profile of a man who'd built a billion-dollar company and deliberately hidden it under worn sweaters and honest conversations in ordinary diners. She thought about her own public visibility, the magazines and the quarterly earnings calls, and the way her face was recognizable in certain rooms. She thought about how carefully she'd kept those versions separate. The Vivian Sterling of the boardrooms and the Vivian who was early to a coffee shop and got her nose bumped while kissing someone on a side street in December. I have a public version too, she said. It's accurate. It's just not all of it. I know. So we'll have two people who live publicly and privately at the same time. That's not unusual. No. He looked at her steadily. I just wanted there to be no hidden thing between us, even a positive hidden thing. She thought about Daniel and the 9 years of carrying her fears privately until the carrying became its own catastrophe. She thought about the diagnosis, held like a secret for 18 months, growing heavier in the keeping. She thought about Renee Chu's voice. You're ready to stop organizing your life around the wound. Thank you for telling me, she said. Of course. I mean it. She looked at him directly. I've spent a long time with people who didn't tell me things because they thought I didn't need to know or couldn't handle it. You tell me things. That matters more than I can say simply. He held her gaze. You can handle anything, he said. That was never the question. What was the question? Whether you'd want to. He paused. Whether you'd let yourself want to. She didn't answer right away. The television bird was still dancing, its elaborate, committed performance going unwitnessed by anyone who mattered. I want to, she said. He nodded once, the same clean nod she'd first seen at the coffee shop the day of the wedding, when she'd told him about the diagnosis and he'd received it without performing his response. Just, I hear you, I'm here. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him. They sat in the comfortable, complicated quiet of two people who have told each other the important things and are beginning to understand what it means to be known. The night everything almost fell apart was a Tuesday in late January, and it began with a profile piece in a national business magazine. The piece was about Vivian, a profile she'd agreed to 6 months ago, before October, before any of this. It was a competent, respectful piece. It covered the company's growth, her early career, the Sterling Capital Fund structure, the acquisition. It also covered, briefly and with what the journalist had clearly intended as sensitivity, the end of her 9-year relationship and her decision to remain focused on her professional life in the aftermath. Sterling has spoken openly in past interviews about prioritizing her work above personal relationships. Whether by design or circumstance, she has built an empire in the space that others might have filled with family. She read the piece at 6:30 in the morning, standing in her kitchen with her coffee, and felt the sentence land the way the journalist had probably not intended it, not as neutral observation, but as the specific quiet judgment that people wrapped in professional language when they wanted to comment on a woman's choices without appearing to comment on them. She sent the link to Ethan without comment. He called within 5 minutes. "That sentence is doing a lot of work," he said. "Yes." "You okay?" "I'm annoyed," she said, which is different from not okay. "What are you annoyed at?" She thought about it. "The assumption that the space where family would have been is empty." She paused. "It's not empty. It's just not shaped the way people expect it to be shaped, which is apparently still a problem to write around." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Are you going to respond?" "Probably not. Responding makes it a story. Not responding lets it be a paragraph." She set her coffee down. "But I'm tired of the paragraph. I've been the subject of that paragraph in various forms since the diagnosis." "What would you want to say if you responded?" "That I don't have what I thought I was going to have, and that what I have instead is real, and enough, and mine." She stopped, heard what she'd said. "That's not a press response." "No," he said. "That's just the truth." "The truth is rarely good PR." "Depends on the audience." He paused. "For what it's worth, I think the paragraph is wrong. I think your life is full. I think it's been getting fuller since October." She picked up her coffee again, held it. "You're going to make me emotional at 6:30 in the morning. Sorry. Don't apologize. It's a good reason to be emotional." He was quiet for a moment. "Come to breakfast Saturday. Bring nothing. We'll just be there." "Noah will have pigeon updates." "Almost certainly." "And pancakes." "Guaranteed." She exhaled. The morning light was coming through the window at the angle it came through in January, lower and more deliberate than in the fall, reaching further into the room. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. "See you Saturday." She put the phone down and looked at the magazine piece still open on her screen. The sentence about the space where family would have been. She thought about Noah's hand in hers at the park, about Ethan's notebook of things worth remembering, about the Saturday mornings and the pigeon named Gerald and the ongoing clouds versus ocean debate and the half-ruined cooking experiments and the specific quality of being with people who didn't require her to perform anything. She closed the tab. Some paragraphs weren't worth the energy of argument. Some things were simply better lived than explained. February came in cold and stayed that way. Noah's science fair project had evolved into something considerably more ambitious than Vivian had anticipated. What had begun as a report on animal navigation had, over the course of several Saturday consultations and 2 weeknight sessions at the kitchen table that ran past his bedtime, become a project called Finding Home: How Animals Know Where They Belong. It covered magnetic fields and echolocation and the sun compass hypothesis in birds. And at some point, Noah had decided it needed an interactive component, which involved a hand-drawn map of the city with 12 marked locations and a chart correlating the locations with animal sightings that he'd been collecting since October. "The park has the most concentrated population," he explained to Vivian, spreading the map on the kitchen table with the authority of a research director presenting findings. "Gerald's pond is the center point. He's the anchor." "Gerald is doing a lot of scientific work," Vivian said. "He's a stable data point," Noah said, which was almost certainly something he'd heard from Ethan and absorbed without realizing it. "Stability is important in a data set." She looked at the map. It was detailed in the way of something produced by someone who cares about accuracy. The park boundaries were correct, the streets were labeled, the animal sighting markers were color-coded by species. He'd spent more than the assigned time on this. That was obvious. "This is genuinely good, Noah," she said. He looked at her. "You're not just saying that." "I don't just say things." He nodded once, satisfied. He'd learned this about her in the same way she'd learned things about him, by paying attention, over time, to the specific way a person operated. Dad says you're one of the most honest people he knows. He said that? Last week, when I asked him why he trusted you. She was quiet for a moment. Ethan was in the kitchen making dinner. Something involving pasta that had already required 2 course corrections and a consultation with the internet. And she could hear him moving around in there, the specific sounds of someone who didn't cook often enough to do it smoothly, but was determined to do it anyway. I trust him too, she said to Noah. Noah nodded. I know. He rolled up his map carefully. I told him to stop being worried about telling you he loved you, by the way. She stared at him. He worries about timing, Noah said, with the resigned air of someone who has managed this particular trait in a parent for years. He thinks everything has to be the right moment, but I told him moments are just regular time that you decided was important. He put the map tube in his backpack. He didn't disagree. When was this? She asked. This morning, he said, at breakfast. He zipped his bag. I made him eggs. I'm very good at eggs now. She looked toward the kitchen, where the pasta situation was apparently improving based on the reduced frequency of course correction sounds. She got up from the table. Ethan was at the stove, sleeves rolled up, reading something on his phone that appeared to be a recipe while simultaneously stirring. He heard her come in and looked up. The pasta's actually going okay, he said. I think I overestimated the complexity. Noah tells me you've been worried about timing, she said. He put the phone down, looked at her with the specific expression of a parent who loves his child enormously and occasionally wants to mail him to a quiet location. He's 7, Ethan said. He made a compelling argument about regular time versus important time. He's been workshopping that one. He set the spoon on the counter, looked at her fully. I had a plan. There was supposed to be a context. We're in a kitchen and the pasta is okay and your son just told me you were afraid of timing, she said. That's a context. He exhaled. Something in him settled. The held thing, the careful thing, the managed timing. Just settled, the way something does when you stop trying to arrange it and let it be what it is. I love you, he said, plainly. No architecture around it. I've known for a while. I kept waiting for the right configuration of the sentence, and Noah apparently decided the waiting was taking too long. She stood in the kitchen in the February evening, the pasta on the stove, the science fair map rolled in a bag in the next room. This man she'd hired for a day watching her with everything he felt completely visible. No performance, no management. I love you too, she said, since probably November. I told Dr. Chu before I told myself. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps, and she met him halfway. And it was nothing like a movie moment. The pasta was still on the stove, and someone needed to deal with that. And she'd walked into the edge of the counter on the way to meeting him and said something inelegant about it. And he laughed, and she did too. And then they were just holding each other in the kitchen, without romance novel coordination, just the actual physical fact of 2 people who'd found something real and were not letting go of it. From the next room, Noah's voice. Is the pasta ready? I can smell it from here. Ethan pulled back slightly. His eyes were doing something warm and wrecked and helpless. We have to feed him, he said. I know. He's going to know. He already knows, she said. He orchestrated this. Ethan looked toward the living room. Noah. Yeah? You're unbelievable. A pause. Then, with profound satisfaction, I know. Vivian pressed her face briefly against Ethan's shoulder, hiding the laugh she couldn't manage to suppress. He held the back of her head with one hand, and with the other reached over and turned the burner down on the pasta before it could go wrong. Dinner was ready in 10 minutes. They sat at the table, all 3. Noah ate with the complete equanimity of someone whose work here was done. Vivian and Ethan kept exchanging the specific glance of people who have just said the enormous thing and are still slightly astonished to be on the other side of it, with the pasta perfectly al dente and a 7-year-old asking for more bread. After dinner, while Noah was cleaning up, he had a chore chart to which he adhered with the solemnity of a professional. Ethan sat across from Vivian at the table and reached for her hand. For the record, he said quietly, I had a much better plan. The kitchen floor plan was fine. It involved a specific restaurant and probably a speech. The speech would have been too much. Probably. He looked at her. Are you? He stopped. Started again. I want to do this right, whatever this is. I want to be someone who shows up right. You've been showing up right since October, she said. The wedding, the diner, the coffee shop, every Saturday, the park in November, the side street in December. She looked at him. You've already been doing it. This is just what it's called now. He held her gaze. From the kitchen, Noah said, I'm done with the dishes. Can we watch the nature documentary tonight? Yeah, buddy, Ethan said without looking away from Vivian. The one about migrations? Sure. A brief silence. Then Noah's voice, quieter, clearly not intended for both of them, but carrying anyway. Good job, me. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Vivian laughed, free and real, the laugh that she couldn't organize before it arrived. He's going to be formidable, she said again. He already is, Ethan said. Again. And then they went into the living room, and Noah commandeered the couch's best section without apology. And the documentary started, and the narration told them about birds crossing entire oceans to find their way to the same place they'd left, driven by something that science could measure but not completely explain. A pull toward where they belonged, reliable as gravity, older than memory. Vivian sat between Ethan and Noah in the warm room, with the February cold on the other side of the windows and the city going on outside with its ordinary indifference, and she was not the woman who'd stood at her bathroom mirror 9 years in and decided she wasn't enough. She was not the woman who'd carried a diagnosis like a secret for 18 months. She was not the woman who'd called an agency at 11:30 on a Wednesday morning out of pure desperation and dressed it up as practicality. She was all of those women, and she was also this, here, present, chosen, choosing. Noah leaned against her shoulder sometime in the first hour. He did it the way he did everything, without asking, with complete confidence in the outcome. His weight was warm and specific against her arm. She didn't move. She stayed exactly where she was and watched the birds find their way home, and felt, without complication, without reservation, that she was already there. Show more 0942p. March arrived the way it always did in this city, indecisively, with one warm day followed by 3 cold ones, as if the season couldn't commit to its own arrival. The trees in Kelsey Park were beginning to produce the first tentative evidence of buds, so small you had to stand close to see them, and Gerald was still on his rock at the duck pond, unchanged by everything that had happened since October, entirely indifferent to the fact that the 2 people who sometimes stood watching him had become something neither of them had been before. Noah noticed the buds before anyone else. The trees are deciding, he announced, on a Saturday morning in early March, standing outside the morning table with his face tilted toward the bare branch above the entrance. You can see them deciding. Deciding what? Vivian asked. Whether to start. He studied the branch. They wait until they're sure. Then they all go at once. She looked at the branch. The buds were barely there. Just the faintest thickening at the nodes. The most preliminary suggestion of green. But he was right. They were deciding. How do they know when they're sure? She asked. They don't, exactly. He dropped his gaze. They just reach the point where staying closed costs more than opening. She looked at him. He was already moving toward the door, done with the observation, ready for pancakes, 7 years old and apparently in possession of more useful knowledge about human experience than most people twice his age accumulated in a decade of trying. Ethan, behind her, said nothing. But she felt him watching her, and she didn't need to turn around to know the expression on his face. They went in. They had breakfast. Noah had the strawberry shake, and she had it too. And they were both right about it, the way they were usually both right about the things that mattered. The Carter Education Summit was in the 3rd week of March, and it was the first time Vivian saw the public version of Ethan in full. She'd known it was coming. He'd told her back in December that the visibility would change things, that the low-profile life would become harder to maintain once the company stepped into full public view. She'd thought she understood what that meant. She discovered, standing in the back of a conference hall at the Meridian Hotel, watching 400 educators, policy people, journalists, and foundation officers listening to him speak, that she had underestimated it somewhat. He was good at it. That was the first thing, not polished in the practiced way of someone trained for a stage, but genuinely authoritative in the way of someone who knew what he was talking about because he'd built it himself, from a specific idea about how children deserved to be taught, and had spent 8 years making the idea real. He spoke without notes for 45 minutes. He was funny in the understated way he was funny in ordinary life, dry, well-timed, never reaching for the laugh. He talked about failure as directly as he talked about success, which was unusual enough in a room like this that she could see people recalibrating, leaning slightly forward. He talked about his son, once, briefly. He said that the question that had organized the company's entire pedagogical model was one his son had asked him at age 5. Why do we have to learn things we already know we don't care about? He said he hadn't had a good answer, and that the inadequacy of his answer had bothered him enough to do something about it. In the back of the room, Vivian stood with her arms folded and felt something she recognized as pride, which she had not felt for another adult in a long time. Not the competitive pride of professional admiration, something more personal and quieter. The kind you feel when someone you love is exactly themselves in public. She had not used the word love even in her own head without a small accompanying awareness of its weight until February. Now it was simply accurate. It fit the thing it was describing without gap or excess. After the main session, there was a reception. She'd come as herself, not as his partner officially, not announced, just Vivian Sterling attending an education summit, which was professionally plausible enough that no one questioned it. But she found him across the room within 20 minutes, and the distance between them closed in the natural way it always closed now, without either of them orchestrating it. That was good, she said. The section on funding models ran long. The section on funding models was the best part. Don't undercut it. He looked at her. You're biased. I'm an objective financial professional, she said, and I'm telling you the funding model section was the best part, except the feedback. The corner of his mouth lifted. Around them, the room was doing its post-panel thing. Clusters of conversations, business cards, the particular energy of people who have been galvanized by something and are trying to convert the energy into something actionable before it dissipates. A woman from a foundation approached him, and then a journalist, and then 2 school district representatives from out of state, and Vivian stepped back and watched him work the room with the same quality he brought to everything, unhurried, honest, not performing anything he didn't feel. She watched people's faces when they talked to him, the way they leaned in, the way the conversation shifted from professional to genuine within a few exchanges. She thought, this is who he was all along, in the diner and the coffee shop and the kitchen making course-corrected pasta. The scale was different. The man was the same. A woman appeared beside her, early 50s, smart eyes, the bearing of someone who had been in a lot of rooms and paid attention in all of them. You're Vivian Sterling, the woman said. I am. I'm Helen Marsh. I run the Marsh Foundation. She extended her hand. I've been following Sterling Capital for 3 years. I know who you are, Vivian said, shaking it. Your education endowment is one of the best structured in the country. Helen glanced toward Ethan. He's impressive. Yes. You know him personally. It wasn't a question. Vivian had apparently not been as neutral in her observation as she'd intended. I do, she said. Helen smiled, with the warmth of someone who found the situation charming and had enough experience to leave it at that. I hope whatever you're building together gets the space it needs, she said. Good things take time. She moved on, leaving Vivian standing there with the particular feeling of being seen accurately by a stranger, which was disorienting and not unwelcome. Ethan found her again an hour later, when the room had thinned. Helen Marsh told me she hopes I know what I have, he said. She told me to give things space. We got the same advice from opposite directions. We usually do. She looked at him. You were really good today. He didn't deflect this time. Thank you, he said, and meant it. They left together, which was the first time they'd left a public event together in a way that was unambiguous, and neither of them commented on it, which was itself a kind of statement. Outside the hotel, the March evening was cold but not bitter, and the city was lit the way it was lit in early spring. The bars and restaurants full, the streets busier than they'd been all winter, everyone out in the tentative warmth like the trees deciding to open. Noah's at my parents' overnight, Ethan said. I know, you told me. I thought we could... He stopped. Actually, I had a plan. She looked at him. Another plan. A different plan. Better than the kitchen floor plan. The kitchen floor plan was perfect, she said. It involved a counter edge and an inelegant sentence. And pasta al dente, and your son saying, good job me, from the next room. She held his gaze. I don't need a better plan. He looked at her for a moment. The hotel lights were behind them, the street ahead. Come with me anyway, he said. Where? You'll see. She raised an eyebrow. He had the expression of someone who had prepared something and was not going to be talked out of presenting it. Okay, she said. He took her to the coffee shop, the one on the corner near her building, with the marble counter and the view she'd looked at 9 years ago, and the morning she'd met him with her burgundy dress and her careful story about mutual friends at a gallery opening. It was 8:30 on a Wednesday evening, and the place was half empty, the after-work crowd gone, just a few people with laptops and a couple near the window speaking quietly over 2 cups of something warm. He led her to the same seats they'd sat in October. She recognized them before he said anything. The same corner, the same sightline, the marble counter catching the light the same way. She sat down. He sat across from her. He was wearing the dark navy sweater, the one with the pulled collar she'd never entirely stopped noticing. He looked like himself, the real version, the daily version, the man who kept notebooks and made food when he didn't know what to say and had raised a person of tremendous character without losing his own. I've been thinking, he said, about what we said in February. In the kitchen. In the kitchen. He folded his hands on the table. And I've been thinking about what it means, going forward, what I want it to mean. She waited. This was different from the kitchen. This had the weight of something he'd been carrying to a specific destination. Noah asked me something last week, he said. He asked if you were going to be a permanent person. She felt her breath catch slightly. What did you say? I said I hoped so, and he said hope wasn't a plan. A pause. He's been getting that from me for years, and I'm beginning to understand how annoying it is to hear back. She almost smiled. Almost. Ethan reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He set a ring on the table between them. Not on her hand, not in the middle of a production, just placed it on the marble surface between their 2 coffee cups. A simple, clean thing, white gold and a modest stone. Nothing decorative or excessive. Something chosen by someone who knew that the gesture mattered more than the object. She looked at it, then at him. I know what you can't give me, he said, and I know what you've believed that means about what you deserve. He held her eyes steadily. I want to be clear that I've never agreed with that belief. Not for one single day since October. What you can't give me is one thing. What you are is every other thing, and the math is not even close. He paused. Noah already knows his answer to this question, by the way. He told me last Tuesday over eggs. He said, and I am quoting directly, obviously yes, Dad, she fits. She couldn't speak. Something in her chest was doing the thing it had done progressively since October, the opening, the slow and cautious, and then less cautious release of the held thing, the long-accumulated tension of a woman who had decided at 30 years old that she was a condition that required management, that the people who loved her needed protection from the full cost of that love. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong in a way that had cost her years. She understood it now not as a failing, but as a decision made with incomplete information, made out of fear and love in equal, tangled measure, by a person who didn't yet know that the right man would look at the full cost of her and say, the math is not even close. I'm not the same person I was on that Sunday morning in October, she said. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was working for it. When I called the agency. I know. I was running an extremely efficient evacuation plan for my own life, clearing space so no one had to deal with the damaged inventory. He flinched slightly at the phrase. Don't. I know. She looked at the ring on the marble counter. I'm saying I'm not doing that anymore. I'm saying I've stopped. She looked at him. I've stopped running the evacuation. I know, he said again, softer. I've been watching you stop. She reached forward and picked up the ring, held it for a moment between her fingers. The weight of it, small and real, the plainness of it, which was its entire point. She looked at him. Yes, she said. She had imagined at various points in her adult life what this moment would feel like. In the earlier imagination, it had involved a restaurant and a speech, and a particular kind of beauty, the curated beauty of an occasion staged to look inevitable. What it actually felt like was this. Sitting in the coffee shop where everything had begun, in the low evening light, across from a man in a navy sweater who had asked her with total honesty and no performance, and feeling not swept away, not overwhelmed, not elevated out of herself, feeling more like herself than she ever had, fully present, fully here, fully choosing. She put the ring on her own finger. He watched. It fit. Of course it fit. He measured it, she said, looking at it. He asked Marcus for help. Ethan's voice had something in it that was trying to be composed and not entirely succeeding. Marcus apparently has a contact at a jeweler. I'm not asking questions. She looked at him. Something in his face was open in the way it had only ever been open with Noah, the unguarded version, the version that didn't manage anything. Your son is a force of nature, she said. I know. He reached across the table and took her hand, the hand with the ring. I've been trying to keep up with him for 7 years. It helps to have someone to do it with. She turned his hand over in hers. The hands she knew now, the ones that made food when words ran out, that had held hers in the dark of a church pew in October, that had fixed her collar on a side street in December without comment, that had reached across a kitchen counter on a February evening when everything finally became what it had been becoming since the beginning. I need to tell you something, she said. Okay. I've been talking to Dr. Chu. She paused. About the diagnosis, about the options. There are some. Not straightforward, not guaranteed, but they exist. She held his gaze. I'm not telling you this as a promise or a plan. I'm telling you because I've been holding it as a private thing for months, which is the old habit, and I'm trying to stop. He was very still. I don't know what's possible, she said. I'm not sure I'll ever fully know, but I stopped closing that door as completely as I'd been closing it. She paused. I closed it because I was afraid of what wanting something I couldn't have would feel like. And then I met a man who had spent 4 years raising a son alone and still believed in the value of keeping things open. Noah talks about it sometimes, Ethan said carefully. About what a sibling would be like. He paused. Not constantly, not with urgency, just the way kids think out loud about things that might exist someday. She looked at him. How do you feel about that? I feel like I have everything I need, he said, and like I'm also open to whatever the future looks like. He squeezed her hand. But I need you to hear me when I say that my answer to this question, he gestured gently at her hand, at the ring, was not conditional, is not conditional. You understand that? I understand that, she said. Good. He exhaled, something in him settling, the same way it had settled in the kitchen in February. Good. They sat in the coffee shop in the March evening, the city running at its ordinary pitch outside the windows, the marble counter between them holding the impressions of 6 months of accumulated meaning. The couple near the window had left. The laptop people remained, insulated in their own small worlds. Vivian looked at the ring on her hand. She thought about the morning in October when she'd stood at her bathroom mirror and felt herself dissolving. When the best solution she could generate was to call a stranger and ask him to stand next to her for a day. When the ambition of the plan had been simply, survive. Get through the afternoon. Don't let them see you fall apart. Come home intact. She had survived the afternoon. But that was the smallest thing that had happened. The real thing, the thing she hadn't budgeted for, hadn't planned, couldn't have managed into existence if she'd tried, was that the stranger had asked the right question, and she had answered it honestly. And from that answer, all the rest of it had grown. That was worth thinking about, worth carrying forward. Because the story people tell about love, about the right person finding you, leaves out the part that actually matters, which is the moment you decide to stop managing yourself into a smaller shape. The moment you put down the careful distance and the practiced version and the efficient system for keeping people from seeing the full inventory. The moment you answer the question honestly, even to a stranger, even in a coffee shop, even when you're in a burgundy dress on the worst morning of the year. The love doesn't find you in that moment, but you become findable. That is the part no one tells you, that the finding is mutual. You have to be willing to be found. Vivian had spent years being excellent at many things, and specifically unavailable for this one thing. And then a bad morning and a necessary phone call, and a man who kept a notebook had, incrementally and without any single dramatic turn, changed the entire architecture of what was possible for her. Not because he was perfect. He wasn't. He second-guessed his timing. He over-explained things when he was nervous. He made elaborate mental plans for conversations and then watched his 7-year-old dismantle them in 30 seconds flat. He had spent years living in deliberate smallness as a corrective to a version of himself he didn't trust. And the corrective had been necessary and also sometimes limiting, and he was still working out which parts of the larger life to allow back in. She wasn't perfect either. She managed people. She assessed structural weaknesses as a first response to anything that mattered. She had spent 18 months making a decision that affected someone else's life without asking him what he wanted, which was a form of arrogance dressed as sacrifice. And she had needed a significant amount of therapeutic conversation and one uncomfortable October afternoon to fully understand that. Neither of them was the person the other would have written from scratch. That was, she had come to believe, exactly the point. You don't fall in love with the person you designed. You fall in love with the person who is actually there. Worn sweater and all, notebook and all, 7-year-old with opinions about pancake texture and geometric pine cones, and the correct interpretation of bravery. The mess of it is the proof of it. The imperfection is the evidence of something real. He drove her home. They sat in the car outside her building for 20 minutes, talking about nothing important, which was itself the most important thing. That they had reached the place where the ordinary conversation was enough, where there was no performance requirement attached to being together, where they could just be two people in a car on a March night and have it be completely sufficient. I'll call Noah tonight, she said when she finally reached for the door. To tell him. He already knows, Ethan said. I told him this morning I was going to ask. What did he say? He said, and I quote, "The coffee shop is the right place. It's where it started." Ethan paused. He is 7 years old and has better narrative instincts than most adults I know. She shook her head slowly. He's going to run the world someday. I know. He looked at her. I hope we're both there to watch. She got out of the car. He waited, which he always did. Waited until she was inside before he drove away. She'd noticed it in November and had never mentioned it. Some things didn't need mentioning. Some things were just how a person was, and you received them quietly. She went upstairs. Her apartment was quiet in the way that no longer felt like a coffin. It felt like her space, her life, the home she'd built, which was real and hers, and which now had a larger perimeter than she'd known it could have. She stood at the window with her coat still on and looked at the city and thought about what Dr. Chu had said back in October. The fact that you went means you're ready to stop organizing your life around the wound. She'd been right. Going to the wedding had been the least of it. The real readiness was what had come after. The willingness to be in the diner, to be in the coffee shop, to be at the breakfast table, to put her hand next to his and let the proximity be what it was. To stay, to let the stain accumulate into something that could hold weight. She called Noah. He answered on the first ring, which suggested he'd been waiting. She said yes, he said, before she could say anything. How do you know? Dad texted Grandma and Grandma has a very loud notification sound. A pause. Also, I knew you'd say yes. Did you? You fit, he said simply. I told him that in October. He took a long time to believe it, but that's okay. He's careful about important things. She stood at the window with the ring on her finger and the city lit up below her, and the thing in her chest that had been opening since October was fully open now. Not in the dramatic way of something breaking, but in the quiet way of something that has completed a process that was always going to end here, in this exactly. Noah, she said. Yeah? Thank you, for the hands at the park, for the seat by the window, for the book with the dragon, for telling your dad that hope wasn't a plan. A brief silence. You're welcome, sir, he said, with the dignity of someone accepting credit appropriately. Then, Vivian? Yeah? I'm glad you called the agency, he said. She pressed her fingers to her mouth. Her eyes were doing what they'd been threatening to do since the coffee shop, and she let them. Me too, buddy. Dad said you were brave. I said I already knew that. A pause. Now get some sleep. We have breakfast Saturday. She laughed. The full, unguarded version, the one that belonged specifically to her life now and the people in it. Okay, I'll see you Saturday. She hung up. Stood at the window for a while longer, looking at the city she'd been looking at for years from this exact spot, the one she'd watched every morning from the window of the apartment she'd built in the silence and called sufficient. It was more than sufficient now. Not because she'd been fixed, there was nothing to fix, because she'd finally understood the difference between a life that was managed and a life that was lived. Because she'd found out, late and lucky and at significant personal cost, that the wound you build your architecture around is not the most permanent thing about you. That the most permanent thing about you is the thing that was there before the wound and remains when you stop guarding it. The capacity for exactly this. For sitting in a coffee shop on an October morning and answering a question honestly. For letting a stranger keep standing next to you. For letting the stranger become someone whose notebook you want to be in. She took her coat off, set it on the chair. She put on the kettle, the tea from the back of the cabinet, the kind she'd found the night she ran out of coffee, and talked for an hour and a half about nothing that could be recapped. She let the water heat. She sat at the kitchen table with her hand resting on the surface, the ring catching the kitchen light, and she thought about the birds in the documentary crossing the whole of the ocean to return to the one specific place that belonged to them. The pull of it, older than memory. The way they didn't question it, just flew toward it, through all the weather and the distance and the sheer implausibility of the journey, because the alternative was not arriving. She thought about what Noah had said outside the restaurant in March. They wait until they're sure. Then they all go at once. She hadn't been sure in October. She hadn't been sure in November or December. She'd been deciding, incrementally, in the way you decide things that matter. Not with certainty, but with increasing willingness to be wrong in this direction instead of safe in the other. And then at some point between December and February and a kitchen and a pasta course correction and a 7-year-old satisfied good job, me from the next room, the deciding had become decided. She reached the point where staying closed cost more than opening. And she had opened. The kettle clicked. She made her tea. She sat with it in the quiet of the apartment that was hers, in the city that was hers, in the life that was hers, and also now, fully and finally, shared. With a man who told her things because she deserved to know them, with a boy who saved her the seat with the best light, with the particular irreplaceable shape of a future she had never been able to imagine from the inside of her bathroom mirror on a bad October morning. She had not imagined this. That was the part that stayed with her, sitting at the table in the March night. She had imagined loss and managed it. She had imagined survival and planned for it. She had imagined moving forward and scheduled it. She had not imagined this exact, specific, imperfect, warm, continuing thing, which meant it was real, which meant it was hers, which meant it had always been the thing waiting at the other end of the honest answer to the right question, if she was only willing to give it. Outside, the March city was doing what it did, loud and indifferent and full of people living their own versions of this same ancient story, the one about the wound and the opening and the finding and the staying, the one that is always, in every version, about the moment you choose to stop running and see what's been standing in front of you all along. Vivian Sterling had built an empire. She had weathered losses that would have dismantled other people. She had carried a diagnosis alone for 18 months and worn it like a verdict. And then she'd called a stranger and worn a burgundy dress and answered an honest question honestly, and the rest of it, the diner, the coffee shop, the park in November, the side street in December, the kitchen in February, the ring on a marble counter in March, had followed. Not because she was healed, not because she'd found someone to complete her in the way of stories that flatten people into halves looking for their other half, but because she had stopped requiring herself to be sufficient alone, which is a different thing and a harder one. She was sufficient, and she was also now part of something larger than her own sufficiency. Both things were true. Both things could be true at once. That was what 9 months and one Wednesday morning had taught her, that you can be whole and still have room. That family is not a thing you're born into or a thing you build according to a plan. It's a thing you recognize. In a stranger at a corner table with black coffee, in a 7-year-old's hand reaching for yours at a park gate, in a notebook kept against forgetting, in the ordinary Saturday morning light coming through a restaurant window, while someone smaller than you eats pancakes with edges and tells you, with complete authority, that you belong. She belonged. That was enough. That was everything.